A murmur extended between the clouds that crowned the Olympus, an echo of power that resonated in every corner of the mortal world. There, at the top of the sacred mount, the gods gathered, each with a presence that could change the river course, arouse storms, or bring calm to the most turbulent souls. Each figure radiated a unique aura, an essence that distinguished them and made them indispensable in the balance of the cosmos. Zeus, everyone's father, dominated heaven. His voice could be as soft as the dew in the morning or as violent as the thunder that left the mountains. He carried the ray, not only as a weapon, but as a symbol of his absolute power. Looking at it was to face the very force of nature. His eyes, always vigilant, seemed to contain the entire night sky. Under his mantle, the fate of men and the gods is woven as an infinite tapestry. At his side was Hera, his queen, a force that was not limited to the role of wife and mother. His presence radiated authority, but also a silent fury, fed by her husband's betrayals. He was the protector of women and marriage, but his jealousy could set fire to entire cities, and his determination was like iron forged iron. Poseidon, with his glowing trident, emanated the ferocity of the ocean. He was more than a sea god, it was the sea itself, unpredictable and ruthless. His footsteps shook the earth, and his laugh was confused with the roar of the waves. The navigators feared and worshipped him, knowing that his life was always at the mercy of his will. Hades did not join them in the Olympus, his kingdom was further, in the shadows of the underworld. Although absent from the heights, its power was undeniable. He ruled the dead with a solemnity that froze the soul. I did not seek adoration or fear, only the fulfillment of the unwavering rules that governed the beyond. Athena, born of Zeus's head, walked with each other with the grace of wisdom and the weight of the strategy. His eyes were an unfathomable well of knowledge, and every word he pronounced had the weight of 1,000 battles won. He was not simply a warrior, it was the incarnation of sharp intellect and impartial justice. Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins, represented the dualities of life itself. Apollo, with his lyre and his golden arrows, brought light, music and prophecy. It was the sun that illuminated the darkest days, but its darts could bring diseases as easily as cure them. Artemisa, on the other hand, was night, hunting, and the moon. His steps were stealthy like the breath of the wind between the trees, and his fury could be as lethal as his love for wild creatures was pure. Aphrodite was a different glow. Its beauty was not limited to the body, it was a magnetism that could collapse empires. It was the desire, passion, and love, but also the torment they brought. Around them, the hearts accelerated, the words broken dreams became obsessions. Hermes, always in motion, was a whirlpool of ingenuity and cunning. His winged sandals took him to where no one else could go, and his words were as fast as his feet. It was the messenger, the thief, the guide, a god who crossed the lines between heaven, earth, and the underworld with disconcerting ease. And then there was Hephaestus, El Herrero Lame, whose hands deformed by work created wonders that no other could match. In his forges, metal came to life, and the gods trusted him to shape their most precious weapons and symbols. Its rude exterior hid an injured soul, a melancholy that no fire could dissipate. Dionysius, with his contagious laugh and his always full cup, was the antithesis of sobriety. But under his mask of joy, a god who understood chaos better than anyone else was hidden. His wine not only brought joy, it was also a mirror for the darkest corners of the soul. Each one had a role, an essence that defined both mortals and the natural world. His interactions were not simple narrative, they were the threads that wove the universe itself. But among them, passions, jealousy, and secret alliances created a whirlwind that threatened to break the balance. Olympus was a place of power, but also of intrigues and human emotions taken to the extreme. There, between the brightness of Zeus's rays and the shadows that projected the arrows of Artemis, stories arose that marked the life of men. A spark of desire, an instant of fury, and the whole world could burn. And among these divinities, Ares and Aphrodite shared a connection that shone and burned with the intensity of a volcano. What seemed to be an eternal love concealed secrets and overflowing passions, and in the heart of this entanglement, Hephaestus expected with his genius and pain as weapons. The Olympus was witness and stage, a place where eternity was never free of conflicts and where love and revenge walked hand in hand. The battlefield was always wrapped in a thick air, a mixture of fear, blood, and an ominous silence that preceded chaos. And in the midst of everything, when the first spear broke the sky and the roar of the warriors filled the air, there was Ares. It wasn't just a god, it was the living incarnation of the conflict. His presence did not need to be announced. He felt in the tremor of the earth, in the accelerated pulse of those who wielded the weapons, in the anger that blinded the soldiers. Born from Zeus and Hera, Ares did not carry peace in his heart. From its origin, it was a god marked by the fire of combat. It was the uncontrolled fury, the rumble of helmets on earth, the rage of those who fear neither to death or defeat. Unlike Athena, which represented the strategy and intelligence in war, Ares was the pure impetus, the brute force that did not calculate consequences. His laughter resonated the more cruel the confrontation was, and his delight in violence was so absolute that not even the gods looked at him without suspicion. Ares was not loved in Olympus. His parents despised him, seeing him as a chaotic and primitive force. Mortals feared him more than venerated him, because his favor could be as destructive as his anger. But he didn't care. I did not look for anyone's approval. In the heart of Ares there was no place for subtleties or masquerades. There was only the confrontation, the clash of swords, the cry of the wounded and the empty look of the fallen. The poets described him as a giant covered with blood, with lit eyes, and a presence that suffocated. He wore a helmet that seemed to absorb light, and his armor shone with a brightness that promised death. His spear never stopped, and his horses, immortal and wild, they pulled their car with a fervor as uncontrolled as that of their master. But Ares was not alone on the battlefield. He was accompanied by Deimos y Phobos, terror and fear, his children and his shadows. Where Ares walked, they followed him, sowing panic in the hearts of the enemies. The mere mention of his name made the most brave men tremble, and the mothers sang to their children songs on how to avoid the gaze of the god of war. Although his fury was feared, Ares was not a god without purpose. In Greek mythology, its importance was to be the purest reflection of human nature in the conflict. It was the reminder that the war was not only a tool, but also an indomitable force, a storm that swept everything in its path. Ares represented what the Greeks understood as the darkest and most true side of war, not honor, not glory, but bare destruction and implacable chaos. In spite of everything, there was something magnetic in him, something that made him irresistible. Aphrodite knew it better than anyone. She, the goddess of love, saw in Ares something that no one else could understand completely. Perhaps it was its fierceness, its passion without limits, or its ability to surrender to the moment with an intensity that matched yours. Between them a bond that did not know reason, a passion that burned regardless of the consequences. Ares, in its essence, was the fire. He burned everything around him, consumed reason and transformed those who crossed their way. But even the fire needs air to burn, and in the Olympus, that air gave it Aphrodite. Together they were a whirlwind, a clash of opposite forces that attracted themselves with the strength of a storm. And while the blood ran in the battlefields, its laughs and whispers mixed with the wind, invisible, but impossible to ignore. The war never ends. Ares knew it, and accepted it. It was his nature, his purpose. As long as the desire for power existed, while hate boiled in human hearts, he would be there, feeding the flame, observing how the world burned around him. But inside, beyond the helmet, spear, and armor, there was something that few understood. Something that Aphrodite perhaps perceived in those moments of vulnerability, when the god who seemed invincible showed the loneliness of those who only know how to live in the midst of the conflict. Ares was not a hero, nor sought to be. His path was not that of redemption or that of repentance. It was the war in flesh and bone, the eternal confrontation, and although the gods despised it and mortals feared it, no one could ignore it. Because in the end, in each war, in each battle lost or won, Ares was present, with his fierce laugh and his eyes full of fire. The waves broke gently against the foam of the sea, and that union, under a rose and gold-dyed sky, Aphrodite was born. It was not a common birth, but an appearance that marked the world with something that had never existed before, a beauty so effulgent that seemed to contain the very essence of creation. From the first moment, the air was filled with an intoxicating perfume, as if the universe itself celebrated its arrival. Every step he took behind him flowers that sprouted even in the most arid rocks. Aphrodite emerged from the waters, radiant, with her hair falling like golden waterfalls on her shoulders and a smile that could stop time. His skin was like the most pure but warm marble, and his eyes contained a mystery that neither the gods nor the mortals could unravel. The hours, daughters of time, dressed it with fabrics that seemed woven with light, while the Zephyros, the soft winds, took it to the shore as if the world could not wait any longer to admire it. From that moment, Aphrodite was not only the goddess of love and beauty, it became the force that linked all living beings in an uncontrollable connection desire. His power did not reside in war or strategy, but in something much deeper and more universal. With a look he could awaken passions impossible to ignore, with a caress he could heal the most broken hearts or destroy the firmer wills. His influence did not know limits. In the Olympus, its presence caused tensions that not even Zeus could control. It was a magnet for desire and admiration, and the gods fought for a simple glimpse of their attention. But Aphrodite was not easy to possess or understand. His love was not quiet or simple, it was a hurricane disguised as breeze, a fire that began with a spark and swept everything in its path. Among mortals, his power was even more devastating. Men and women fell to their image, unable to resist the influence of their beauty. But Aphrodite was not just romantic love, it was love in all its forms. It was the overflowing passion, the unconfessable yearning, the desire that pushed hearts to look for what seemed impossible. In wars, its influence could be as powerful as ours, because a soldier who fights for love can be as unstoppable as one who struggles for hate. However, Aphrodite was not immune to the whims of her own heart. Although she was married to Hephaestus, the god of fire and forge, her love was not limited to the chains of marriage. His relationship with Hephaestus was a mystery for many. He, with his body marked by scars and his heavy walk, seemed an absolute contrast with Aphrodite's grace. But it was precisely his ability to create wonders with his hands that attracted it at first. Although it was never a true love, Hephaestus represented something she rarely found: unwavering devotion. But Aphrodite was free as the wind, and her heart did not know barriers. It was Ares who aroused in her a passion that no divine rule could suffocate. The god of war and the goddess of love were opposite in every way, but that same contradiction united them. Aphrodite saw in Ares something that no one could understand, a soul as intense and overflowing as his. Together they shared moments that were both an explosion of desire and a vulnerability refuge. It was a connection that challenged Olympus and the same gods who tried to judge them. Aphrodite also had a dark side, a facet of her power that could be as destructive as creator. Its ability to inspire love could easily transform into jealousy, obsession, and chaos. On more than one occasion, the hearts he touched were wrapped in tragedies of which no one left unharmed. Because the love that Aphrodite represented was not perfect or idealized, it was raw, real, and deeply human. The myths say that their powers were so immense that even the goddesses were not safe from them. Hera, Athena, and Artemis, despite their greatness, felt uncomfortable in their presence. It was not fear what they felt, but a mixture of respect and rivalry that always made them cautious. Aphrodite did not need weapons or strategies, his mere existence could eclipse the most powerful deities. Among mortals, Aphrodite inspired some of the most heartbreaking stories. It was she who driven Helena de Troy to be the center of the conflict that devastated two great civilizations. It was his gift, the golden apple of Paris's trial, which unleashed the Trojan War, a war that symbolized the power of love and desire taken to the limit. But even in the midst of the tragedy, Aphrodite remained as a symbol of what life was worth living, the tireless search for something bigger than oneself. In its essence, Aphrodite was a paradox. She was the creator of the union, but also responsible for the most painful separations. It was the force that brought peace to hearts and, at the same time, the chaos that tore them. His beauty was not simply physical, it was a reflection of the complexity of love, with all its lights and shadows. Aphrodite, Dionyso born from the sea, not only changed the Olympus, he transformed the gods and men forever. And on the horizon, its history with Ares began to take shape, a story that would resonate in Olympus with the strength of a storm. The fire squeaked in the depths of the mountain, illuminating the face of a god whose story began in rejection. Hephaestus was not received with applause or praises at birth. His mother, Hera, when contemplating his imperfect form, threw him from Olympus as if his only existence were an affront to his pride. The newborn fell from the heights, hitting the rocks and the sea, a descent that marked not only his body, but also his destiny. When it was finally collected by Thetis and Eurynome, ocean goddesses, Hephaestus was nothing more than a shadow of what would become. The fall left it with a permanent limp, a physical reminder of its painful origin. But, instead of consuming it, that pain became its strength. Under the shelter of the marine depths, Hephaestus discovered something that would give it purpose, the art of molding the metal. There, with the rudimentary tools provided by the goddesses, he began to transform his frustration into creation, his rejection of art. The injured child became a master of fire, a god whose power did not reside in brute force, but in his ability to shape the impossible. When he finally returned to Olympus, his talent was already impossible to ignore. Each blow of his hammer resonated with the accuracy of a beat, every spark that sprouted his forge seemed to contain his own life. Hephaestus was not a warrior like Ares, nor did he possess Apollo's charism, but what he created with his hands exceeded any feat of the most venerated gods. His fingers, marked by the flames, gave life to objects that the gods covered. Armor that could stop any attack, jewels that shone like stars and thrones that seemed to float over nothing. Among his most memorable creations was Zeus's ray, the maximum symbol of heavenly power. It was he who forged him, who gave him the perfect balance between devastation and control. He also created the winged sandals of Hermes, the indestructible spear of Athena, and the magic belt of Aphrodite, an object that amplified his already unmatched capacity for seduction. Every work that came out of his workshop was unique, a piece that challenged the laws of the known world. But Hephaestus was not only a tool and weapons forge, he was also a creator of living wonders. Among his most amazing works were Talos, the bronze giant who protected Crete's island. This colossus was not only a machine, he had a soul, or at least something that approached him. In it, Hephaestus shows that his art could rival even that of the creative gods of life. However, not all their gifts were to protect. His talent could also be a weapon of revenge. When he discovered the betrayal of Aphrodite with Ares, Hephaestus devised a trap that was registered forever in mythology. With implacable precision, he forged such a fine gold network that he was invisible to the naked eye, but so strong that no one could escape it. He placed the network on his bed and waited patiently. When Aphrodite and Ares succumbed to their passion, they were trapped, exposed to all the gods. It was not an act of violence, but of ingenuity, a sample of how even the most wounded can find ways to claim. Despite his genius, Hephaestus carried with him a melancholy that not even the flames could dissipate. He was a lonely god, always left from the noisy meetings of Olympus. His workshop, located in the bowels of active volcanoes, was his refuge. There, surrounded by the rumble of metal and suffocating heat, Hephaestus found peace in creation. But even in the midst of his work, there were times when silence weighed, a constant reminder of his place in a world that seemed not to know how to love him. However, Hephaestus did not seek anyone's compassion. His identity was not defined by Hera's rejection or the laughter that sometimes resonated behind them. Every work that came out of his forge was proof that, despite his pain, he had a purpose. Hephaestus did not need the admiration of the gods, he knew that Olympus would not work without him. Although the brightness of his creations was not always reflected in his life, his talent remained the backbone of a world that often forgot it. In Olympus, Hephaestus was the only one who could manipulate the fire without burning. But, inside, the fire that boosted it also consumed it. Aphrodite, despite his indifference, was for him a constant reminder of what he longed for but would never have. Even so, Hephaestus did not let the heartbreak define it. His hands, marked by the effort, continued to mold wonders that no other could imagine. Hephaestus was not a god of imposing appearance or eloquent words, but his legacy was unquestionable. Every ray that illuminated the sky, every shield that protected a warrior, every jewel, each interaction carried a mixture of love, envy, desire, and resentment, as if eternity amplified the emotions that mortals could barely understand. In that scenario where the stars mixed with thunder, Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus formed a triangle that summarized the contradictions and tensions of the entire divine community. Zeus, the king of the gods, imposed his power with the strength of a ray, but his authority was constantly challenged by Hera, his wife and sister, whose cunning and pride did not know limits. Athena, born of the Zeus skull, represented wisdom and strategy, but even she was not free of rivalries. Poseidon ruled the oceans, their temperament as changing as the waves, while Apollo and Artemis, twin brothers, shone like light and shadow in perfect synchrony. However, behind this facade of power and greatness, the gods were as vulnerable as mortals to the whims of love and desire. Aphrodite was the epicenter of many of these emotions. Its single presence altered the balance of Olympus. It represented something that no other god could control, the desire in its purest and most chaotic form. Ares, the god of war, was one of the first to succumb to his influence. Among them there was no smoothness or serenity. His love was like a battle, a clash of opposite forces that attracted themselves with a scorching intensity. While Ares found in Aphrodite a shelter for her fury, she saw in him a passion that matched her own overwhelming energy. Hephaestus, on the other hand, was the absolute contrast. If Ares was fire and explosion, Hephaestus was a constant brazier, a flame that burned slowly but deeply. Like her husband, she offered Aphrodite a stability that she rarely sought. Her love for her was not involved in the impulsive desire, but in a devotion built through her art. Hephaestus forged a magical belt, a symbol of his love and his desire to please it, but also a tool that amplified its already uniqueness of seduction. Ironically, that gift only fed the passion she shared with others, especially with Ares. The relationship between these three gods was not just a private matter, it was a crack that divided the Olympus and exposed the deepest tensions among its inhabitants. The gods delighted with the drama, unable to resist the temptation to comment, observe and, sometimes, interfere. Zeus, although omnipotent, did not intervene directly, perhaps because he saw in these disputes a reflection of his own disorderly heart. Hera, on the other hand, found in Aphrodite a rival who embodied everything she despised and, at the same time, feared. The tensions reached their peak when Hephaestus, fed up with the betrayal of Aphrodite and Ares, devised his famous trap. The invisible network that forged with master precision captured lovers in an act of passion, leaving them exposed to all the gods. The scene was so much a humiliation for Aphrodite and Ares and an affirmation of the ingenuity of Hephaestus. But this bitter victory did not solve anything. Instead of calming the waters, he only intensified the dynamics of power and resentment in the Olympus. Despite these rivalries, the gods were unable to separate themselves completely. They were intertwined not only by the family, but also by the primary forces they represented. Ares could not exist without Aphrodite, because love and war were two sides of the same currency. Hephaestus, although despised by some, was indispensable for the balance of the Olympus. Their creations held the gods, both in battle and in everyday life. In this intricate passion game, every god had his role. Aphrodite, with her irresistible magnetism, kept the others trapped in their orbit. Ares, with its impulsive character, was both an ally and a threat. And Hephaestus, with his melancholic perseverance, remembered everyone that even in Olympus, pain and genius could coexist. The dynamics among them were not a simple love and betrayal story, they were a reflection of the divine condition, where human feelings were magnified until reaching epic proportions. In each look, every shovel bra, and every action, Ares, Aphrodite and Hephaestus wove a narrative that transcended their own existence, leaving an indelible mark on the Olympus and in the heart of those who dared to listen to their stories. But passions in Olympus never went out at all. The tensions between Ares, Aphrodite and Hephaestus were just a fragment of a much greater drama, a set of forces in constant movement that continued to shape the fate of the gods and mortals equally. And while laughter and whispers went out in the rooms of Olympus, it was clear that the true battles, which hurt more deeply, did not get rid of swords, but with flames. The first time Ares saw Aphrodite, time seemed to stop. In the middle of Olympus, between the golden glows and the voices of the gods, she shone like the sun at dawn, unattainable and irresistible. It was not only his beauty that attracted him, although that was enough for anyone to lose his reason. There was something deeper in Aphrodite, an energy that resonated with his own, a passion that challenged him and completed him at the same time. Ares, the god of war, knew chaos, but Aphrodite taught him a different form of intensity, one that could not control or conquer. For Aphrodite, Ares represented an overwhelming, raw and unrestricted force. Unlike Hephaestus, who loved her from a distance with an almost shy devotion, Ares wanted her with an urgency that matched his. In his eyes, he didn't see caution or judgment, just fire. Where others sought to undergo their charm, Ares struggled to be by their side as an equal. Aphrodite felt in him a dangerous freedom, a flame that could consume them both, but could not ignore. Your connection was not soft or simple. It was an attraction full of intensity, such as the shock of two storms. In the presence of Ares, Aphrodite felt her heart to beating faster, her mind clouds, and her will staggers. It was a love that did not know serenity, but that it was not a battle of strength, but of desire, of emotions that disarmed him and made it vulnerable. At night, while Olympus slept, Ares and Aphrodite were secret, far from the indiscreet looks. His caresses were burning, desperate, as if each encounter could be the last. At that time, Ares was not the god of war, and Aphrodite was not the goddess of love. They were only two souls trapped in a whirlwind that united them and destroyed them at the same time. Each kiss was a broken promise, every whisper a challenge to the world that surrounded them. But his love was not just physical. There was a depth in their connection that few understood. Aphrodite saw in Ares something that he himself rarely showed, a hidden vulnerability after his invincibility facade. Ares, the relentless warrior, could be defeated by a simple look of her. And Ares, in turn, understood the weight that Aphrodite loaded, the price of being the center of all eyes and desires. In their forbidden love, they found a mutual shelter, a place where they could be themselves without masks or claims. However, its relationship also had a dark side. The intensity that united them often became conflict. Ares, with his explosive temperament, was jealous and possessive. Aphrodite, with her free spirit, resisted any attempt to control. His discussions were as passionate as their reconciliations, a dangerous dance that maintained the balance between love and destruction. At that time, it was impossible to know if their love would save or ruin them. The Olympus, although full of secrets, could not ignore what was happening. Rumors about their relationship extended as fire, and the gods watched with a mixture of fascination and envy. Some, like Apollo, saw him as a scandal, others, like Hermes, considered it a simple distraction. But none could deny the magnetic force that linked Ares and Aphrodite. It was a story that challenged divine norms, a reminder that even the gods were not immune to the power of love and desire. The most explosive moment of his relationship came with the Hephaestus trap. Trapped in the golden network, exposed in the eyes of all, Ares and Aphrodite faced public humiliation. But even then, his love did not vanish. While the gods made fun of, they looked at each other with a mixture of challenge and passion. Ares, humiliated but not defeated, promised to avenge that moment. Aphrodite, although injured, knew that her connection with Ares was something that she couldn't even break. Ares and Aphrodite were not a conventional couple, they were a clash of primary forces, a union that represented the best and the worst of Olympus. His love was as powerful as destructive, as beautiful as dangerous. And although his story was full of pain and conflict, none of them could imagine a life without the other. In each battle, in every whisper, in each look, Ares and Aphrodite showed that love and war were not opposite, but two sides of the same currency. It was a golden afternoon in Olympus, when the wind carried with them the murmur of the heavenly rivers and the song distant from the muses. Aphrodite was sitting next to a crystalline water source, her fingers to play with the surface as if she were drawing invisible secrets. His laugh, light and melodic, mixed with the murmur of water. I did not know that, in the shadows of the marble pillars, burning eyes watched her with an intensity that could almost feel in the air. Ares, the god of war, had seen her many times before, but never as at that time. There was something in the way the sunlight was reflected in his hair, in the carefreeness with which he moved his hands, which left him motionless. It was not a common beauty that posted Aphrodite, it was a force that disarmed, a magnet that attracted even the most implacable. And Ares, who had always found his strength in battle, felt that at that moment he had lost a fight that he didn't even know he had begun. She looked up, and her eyes met. Aphrodite did not look away, his curiosity was as intense as his. He had heard stories about Ares, about his courage on the battlefield and his uncontrollable temperament. He was a feared god, respected, but also misunderstood. However, at that time, in front of her, there was no warrior, but a man who seemed to have forgotten how to talk. Aphrodite smiled, and that simple action was like a ray crossing Ares's defenses. The first encounter was brief, an almost trivial exchange. But both felt something they could not ignore. Aphrodite, accustomed to being the center of attention, perceived something different in Ares. I didn't look at her like others, not with simple desire or admiration. There was recognition in his eyes, as if he saw beyond his appearance, beyond the goddess they all venerated. And that, more than any praise, aroused an interest that had not felt before. Ares, on the other hand, found himself returning to the same place again and again, hoping to see her again. And Aphrodite, although he pretended that his presence was casual, he knew exactly what he was doing. Each match was a game, a dance of words and looks that became increasingly intense. Ares, who had never been known for his patience, discovered that he was willing to wait, to fight his own nature, just because he was close to her. Over time, their conversations became deeper. They talked about things that had never shared with anyone else, the fears they hid, the loads they carried as gods, the things they wanted but always seemed out of reach. Ares, whose life was marked by violence and destruction, was surprised to find comfort in Aphrodite's voice. And Aphrodite, who had always been admired but never understood, felt seen for the first time. There was something electric in those first meetings, an energy that grew with each word, each accidental rubbing. It wasn't just attraction, it was a connection that challenged Olympus's rules. Ares was impulsive, fierce, and Aphrodite was delicate but imposing. They were opposite in many ways, but that only made their link stronger. Like the fire that needs air to burn, they fed each other in a way that none could resist. The moment in which his relationship ceased to be simply pools and looks loaded with meaning was a night in which the sky was covered with stars. They had ended in a clear, far from Olympus, where silence was only interrupted by the song of the crickets. Ares, for the first time in his life, felt vulnerable. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words seemed to be trapped in his throat. It was Aphrodite who broke the silence, with a softness that seemed to wrap it. "Why are you still looking for me?" he asked, his voice just a whisper. Ares looked at her, her hardened face softening. "Because I can't help it," he replied, his sincere tone. Aphrodite felt a knot in the stomach. It was at that moment that both understood that there was no reversal. The barriers they had maintained were broken, and what began as a spark became a fire. That night, under the glow of the stars, their relationship flourished. The consequences did not matter, what the Olympus thought did not matter. At that moment, there were only two souls who had found something they didn't know what they were looking for. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Each encounter was more risky, but also more intense. They knew that their relationship was dangerous, that they were playing with fire, but neither wanted to stop. Ares loved the passion with which Aphrodite lived, the way he even transformed the smallest moments into something significant. And Aphrodite was attracted to the rawness and honesty of Ares, for her ability to be fierce and protect her at the same time. But, although their hearts were on fire, a shadow began to form on them. They knew that their love would not be accepted, that they were challenging the rules of a world where even the gods were subject to rules. And although they still did not know, the first thread of the Hephaestus network was already being woven, ready to catch them in a trap that would change everything. In the Olympus, where immortality did not guarantee happiness, the passion of Aphrodite and Ares became an open secret, a whisper full of danger that traveled like the wind between the gods. Each poaching, every encounter in the shadows, was a spark in the fire of its relationship. They knew that what they shared was prohibited, that their love was an open challenge not only to Hephaestus, but also to the fragile balance that supported Olympus. But that knowledge did not turn off the flames, I fueled them. Aphrodite, married to Hephaestus, had accepted that marriage by obligation, not for love. Hephaestus, the god of fire and forges, was kind and dedicated, but his world was cold and distant. He spent his days in the heat of his forge, creating wonders that impressed everyone but her. Aphrodite did not look for a husband who worshipped her like an unattainable muse. I yearned for an equal, someone who could face its intensity. In Ares he found what Hephaestus never gave him, passion without reservations, a visceral love that was not afraid to burn in the process. For his part, Ares knew that Aphrodite did not belong to him. He was aware that every moment with her was stolen, a fragment of time taken from the world that condemned them. But I couldn't get away. For Ares, Aphrodite was not just the goddess of love, it was his salvation, the refuge in which he found more than war and blood. In his arms, the roar of the battle was silenced, and everything that was left was her laugh, her perfume, the magnetic force of her gaze. Hephaestus, although he was not a warrior, was no stranger to the tensions that surrounded him. He knew that Aphrodite did not love him as he wanted, but he closed his eyes to reality, clinging to the idea that his love for her would be enough. However, rumors began to reach their ears, each more cruel than the previous one. At first, he discarded them as Olympus gossip, but the accomplices between Aphrodite and Ares, prolonged absences, became impossible to ignore. The Olympus, as always, delighted in the drama. The gods watched from the shadows, some with envy, others with malice. Hera, in her pride, saw in the infidelity of Aphrodite an offense that tarnished the prestige of her own marriage to Zeus, full of betrayals and grudges. Apollo, with his sharp sarcasm, commented quietly while Hermes just smiled, as if all that was a cosmic joke. No one intervened, they preferred to observe, enjoy the show that promised an explosive outcome. The encounters between Ares and Aphrodite became bolder over time. Sometimes they were in the forests, in the moonlight, where the song of the crickets and the whisper of the leaves covered the sound of their words. Other times, it was in abandoned temples, where the walls were mute witnesses of their forbidden love. Every time they were together, the world seemed to fade, as if time and consequences did not exist. But Hephaestus, in silence, began to put his revenge. He was not a god of words or confrontations, but his mind worked as an oven, slow but implacable. He observed, listened, and finally, he devised a trap that would not only expose lovers, but also restore his dignity before the eyes of others. In his forge, he forged a gold network as fine as hair, but stronger than any metal. Invisible to the human eye, but indestructible, it was designed to catch Aphrodite and Ares in the spot. The night the trap was activated, Aphrodite and Ares found themselves in the bedroom she shared with Hephaestus. Ares, as it always cautious, he doubted before entering, but Aphrodite calmed him with a touch on his arm, his smile disarming him as always. They were too absorbed in each other to notice the subtle mechanisms that Hephaestus had placed in the room. It was only when the network fell on them, bright and cold, who understood what had happened. Hephaestus, with a mixture of pain and satisfaction, called the gods to witness the betrayal. One by one, they arrived, their faces reflecting a mixture of amazement and guilty pleasure. Aphrodite and Ares, trapped in an intimate position, could not move or hide. His faces burned with shame, but his eyes were still connected, challenging the judgment of others. Although they were exposed and humiliated, their love had not been destroyed. Zeus, with an authoritarian gesture, ordered the network to be removed. He looked at Hephaestus with an expression that mixed approval and disgust. Although Hephaestus had demonstrated his ingenuity, he had also exposed the weaknesses of the Olympus so that everyone saw them. Ares, released from the network, left the room without saying a word, his wounded pride but his will intact. Aphrodite, with his head high, faced the looks of the gods, his dignity intact despite shame. But the trap was not the end. It was just a chapter in a story that was far from finishing. The love between Ares and Aphrodite could not be contained by a network, or by public humiliation. It was a love marked by pain and desire, but also by a force that even the gods could not fully understand. Hephaestus, although he had won that battle, had failed to turn off the fire that burned each other. And while Olympus continued to murmur about betrayal, Ares and Aphrodite knew that his story was just beginning. Hephaestus was in his forge, surrounded by the constant roar of the fire and the rhythmic pounding of his hammer against the incandescent metal. That place, his refuge and his prison, was witnessing his greatness as a creator and the silent weight of his loneliness. But that afternoon, something was different. The spark that always lit his passion for work was not, instead, there was a dark tension that seemed to fill every corner. I had heard the rumors, of course. In Olympus, where words flew faster than the wind, the whispers of betrayal had become a deafening choir. Aphrodite and Ares. The words resonated in their mind as an endless echo. Hephaestus had suspected for a long time, but had refused to accept what he now seemed inevitable. Aphrodite, the goddess who had sworn to be her wife, and Ares, the god of war, sharing something they had never given to him: passion, desire, delivery. It was a thought that corroded from within, like a slow poison that extended through its veins. The pain was unbearable. It was not only Aphrodite's betrayal that destroyed him, but also the humiliation he brought. Hephaestus had always known that it was not like the other gods. While they shone perfectly, he was born differently, even rejected by his own mother, Hera. Since childhood he had fought to earn a place in Olympus, building wonders that others praise, but never really understood. And now, the woman who had promised to be by her side had despised him in the most cruel way. But the pain soon became more dark: jealousy. A burning feeling, as intense as the fire that fed its forge. The jealousy devoured him, they blinded him, they boosted him to imagine Aphrodite again and again in his arms, laughing, loving him, sharing with him something that Hephaestus had never felt. That image made him tighten his teeth and hit the metal with more force, as if with each blow he could destroy the memory that tormented it. Ares. The mere mention of his name caused Hephaestus to turn on as a storm. What did he have that Hephaestus couldn't offer? Was it his strength, his power, his arrogance that had conquered Aphrodite? Hephaestus hated him with each fiber of his being. But more than Ares, he hated the vulnerability he felt, the void that left him exposed, naked in front of a world that had always seen him as less. Aphrodite had not only betrayed a husband, he had betrayed a man who, in his clumsy and silent way, had loved her more than she could imagine. The forge became the place where Hephaestus poured all his anger. The metal he forged carried the weight of his frustration, of his helplessness. Each weapon, every jewel, every object that created seemed to reflect its internal torment. But it wasn't enough. Hephaestus knew that work would not save this time. He needed something else, something that would allow him to recover control, even for a moment. It was then that he began to devise his plan. The trap that Hephaestus built was not just a masterpiece of the divine up, it was an extension of his own suffering. Each golden thread that wove in the network carried the weight of their pain and anger. While working, his mind was filled with images of Ares and Aphrodite, his laughter, his eyes. I imagined the moment when the network would close on them, catching them in their betrayal. It wasn't just revenge what I was looking for, it was justice, a way to balance the balance that had always been against him. But as the network wove, Hephaestus could not help asking if it really would be enough. Although it caught Aphrodite and Ares, even if he exposed them to the other gods, would something change? Would Aphrodite look at him with respect, with love? Or would it simply despise him even more for having exposed his shame? That doubt tormented him, but he didn't stop him. Anger and jealousy were too strong, an engine that drove it to move on. The day he activated the trap, Hephaestus felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. I knew that, as soon as the network fell, there would be no going back. The entire Olympus would witness his pain and his strength, in the way in which a despised god could claim his place. When the network finally closed on Aphrodite and Ares, catching them in their golden hug, Hephaestus felt momentarily triumphant. He had achieved what he intended, to expose lovers and recover, even for a moment, the control of his own narrative. However, while the other gods arrived, laughing and pointing to trapped lovers, Hephaestus felt something unexpected: a void. The scene I had imagined again and again did not bring him the relief he expected. Aphrodite, even trapped, kept his head up, his eyes full of challenge. Ares, although humiliated, did not show regret. And Hephaestus, standing between them and the other gods, realized that their revenge had not turned off the fire of jealousy I had fed it. That night, as he returned to his forge, Hephaestus understood that jealousy was an enemy who could not beat with tools or traps. The wound that Aphrodite and Ares had left in his heart was deeper than he had imagined, and the network he had woven had not only caught lovers, but also himself, in an endless cycle of pain and resentment. And although he knew that Olympus would continue talking about his revenge, Hephaestus could not help asking himself if one day he would find a way to heal. Hephaestus was not a god of great speeches or rimbombant words. His power did not reside in diplomacy or empty promises, but in his ability to create, to shape what others could not even imagine. And now, that talent of forge would use it for more than weapons or jewels. I would use it for your revenge. The forge, its lonely kingdom, resonated with the echoes of the hammer hitting the metal. The fire of the forge illuminated the room with a red and warm light, but Hephaestus only brought him a cold that took over his chest. Steel and gold shone in the dark, but there was nothing else in the world that interested him more than the way the betrayal had destroyed him. Aphrodite, his wife, the goddess of love and beauty, had fallen in the arms of Ares, the god of war, the same man who despised everything he represented. Hephaestus could not forget it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his faces, Ares, with his muscular body, proud of his power, Aphrodite, beautiful as a dream, smiling at him, completely surrendered. Something broke in Hephaestus at that precise moment, something that could never be repaired. And rage, that ancestral fury that seemed to grow inside him, led him to make a decision. If love and trust had not been returned to him, then he would use what he knew best to do, forge something that could not only catch his enemies, but also expose them in the most humiliating way possible. He spent days in his workshop, sometimes without eating, without resting, obsessed with his plan. He knew that what he was about to do was risky, that revenge never brought peace, but the pain of betrayal clouded his judgment. Each blow to metal seemed to free something inside him, a mixture of suffering and desire for justice. The trap that began to create would not be visible to the naked eye, but when it fell, not only Ares and Aphrodite would be the ones that were trapped, he would be, in a network of emotions that he could not even control. He forged the network with firm hands, with a skill that only a god of the blacksmith could have. Gold thread shone, almost unreal, but it wasn't just beauty what Hephaestus looked for. Each thread was impregnated with a spell, an enchantment that, when activated, would make the network close so that neither Ares nor Aphrodite could escape. It was designed to be invisible, so that no mortal eye could see the trap. But deep down, Hephaestus knew it wasn't just to catch physically. His revenge went beyond simple physical punishment. I wanted to see them exposed, vulnerable to the look of the other gods, humiliated before the entire Olympus. Every day, while the network took shape, Hephaestus thought of Aphrodite. How he had moved away from him, how he had let his charms blind him and take him to Ares's arms. He thought of his laugh, the way he moved, so sure of herself. How had he been able to forget him so easily? How had he allowed herself to fall into that relationship? The pain was deep, but anger, that had accumulated for so long, began to become something else, a need to demonstrate that no one, not even a god as powerful as Ares, could make fun of him without consequences. With the finished network, Hephaestus thought about how to activate it. It was not enough for me to simply drop on them, it had to be a trap that not only catch their bodies, but also their hearts. He needed to make sure that when he fell, it would be the end of any fantasy of power that Ares could have and any hope that Aphrodite had to escape. The trap, however, was only the first part of his revenge. Because Hephaestus knew that what he did would not only affect lovers, but also himself. Somehow, what I was about to do would mark it forever. I could see Aphrodite's gaze when the network fell on her, that disdain, that surprise, that confusion. And Ares, with his arrogance, would surely react with fury, perhaps seeking to destroy Hephaestus immediately. But what terrified him was not his revenge in himself, but what would happen later. What if this only left more injured in his soul? What if, in his attempt to take revenge, he only managed to sink more into the abyss of his own pain? But the decision was taken. The trap was ready. It was only waiting. The days passed, and Hephaestus, while retiring to his forge, planned the exact moment in which he would activate the trap. He knew that Aphrodite and Ares would continue to see each other in secret, regardless of what happened. And when they did, he would be ready. Without hurry, without fear. The invisible and mortal network would fall on them as a storm that drags everything in its path. What Hephaestus could not know at that time, however, it was that his revenge would change him forever. What he thought was just a way of punishing traitors would become something much more complex. Because when the trap finally fell, not only Ares and Aphrodite will be trapped, but Hephaestus would also be trapped in a network of jealousy, revenge, and, perhaps, the desire deeper than ever dared to admit. In the heart of Hephaestus' forge, the fire burned with an intensity that seemed to reflect the tumult inside. The creation of the magic network was not just an act of divine engineering, it was a manifestation of the emotional storm that consumed it. Every spark that jumped from the live metal carried with him a fraction of his anger, his humiliation and, above all, his uncontrollable desire for justice. Hephaestus had decided that if Olympus was full of gods who played with the hearts of others, he would demonstrate that even the strongest could be vulnerable. The network design was a masterpiece. Threads of pure gold, as fine as hair but imbued with a power that no mortal or god could break. Hephaestus did not limit a simple network to weave, each thread carried complex enchantments, engraved runes with millimeter precision that ensured their invisibility and the impossibility of escaping. While working, old words murmured, invoking arcane forces that I had never used before. It was a job that required more than technical skill, it demanded an absolute concentration, a total commitment to its purpose. The nights in the forge became long, endless. Hephaestus barely slept, his mind busy perfecting every detail. The network should be as perfect as Aphrodite was in its beauty and as relentless as Ares on the battlefield. Gold shone in firelight, but Hephaestus was barely noticed. His gaze was fixed, as if he could see in the threads the images of the lovers who would soon be trapped. Ares and Aphrodite. Their names were like a poison in their language, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had taken him to this point. While working, Hephaestus remembered moments of his life that had molded him. He remembered Hera's contempt, who had thrown him from Olympus for his deformity, and how he had built his reputation from nothing. He remembered the teasing of other gods, always so fast to belittle him. And now, when he thought he had found something close to happiness with Aphrodite, fate gave him another slap. What would you really win with this? Would something change? These questions tormented him, but they didn't stop his hands. Finally, after endless days and nights, the network was ready. Hephaestus held her in her hands, admiring her work. It was light as a pen, but its strength was incomparable. Invisible to the mortal and divine eye, the network would be activated only when the lovers were trapped in their illicit hug. Hephaestus had assured that no detail escaped, the network would be undetectable until the moment it fulfilled its purpose. There would be no warnings, there would be no opportunity to flee. With the finished network, Hephaestus allowed a moment of pause. He watched her under the dim light of the forge, feeling a mixture of pride and bitterness. He had created innumerable objects throughout his life, weapons for heroes, palaces for gods, wonders that the world would never forget. But this network was different. It wasn't just an object, it was a testimony of his humanity, his ability to love, suffer, and desire justice. The network seemed to vibrate in his hands, as if he were alive, waiting for the time to fulfill his purpose. Hephaestus placed her carefully in a chest, making sure she was protected until the day she needed it. While closing the chest, he felt a weight in his chest. I knew I was about to cross a line, to take a path that would not be back. But the pain of betrayal was stronger than any warning that could give itself. That night, while the drafts of the forge went out slowly, Hephaestus sat in silence, looking at the shadows dance on the walls. The network was ready, but the real test was still coming. How would the gods react? How would Aphrodite react? These questions assaulted him, but he knew there was no place for doubt. What was done was done. The magical network, his most personal and devastating work, patiently waited for the moment of truth. And Hephaestus, caught between his pain and his desire for revenge, knew that this moment would soon arrive. The night had fallen on Olympus, wrapping the divine world in a mantle of shadows and stars. In a section, far from the curious looks of the gods, Ares and Aphrodite found themselves, as they had done so many times before. There was a tension in the air that was not new, a mixture of danger and I want to unite them in one way that neither could resist. Ares, with his proud bearing and his penetrating gaze, seemed more a predator stalking his prey. Aphrodite, wrapped in an almost unreal beauty halo, watched him with a smile that promised both pleasure and destruction. The place chosen for his meeting was a private camera in Olympus, a shelter that they believed secret. The marble walls were decorated with frescoes that told love and war stories, as if they wanted to reflect the very nature of their relationship. There, in that section, lovers gave themselves to the fervor of their passion, completely forgetting the world that surrounded them. Each caress, every whisper, was a challenge to the rules that governed their lives, a statement that their love, although forbidden, was as powerful as the gods themselves. But what neither Ares nor Aphrodite could know was that the shelter was not as safe as they believed. In the shadows, invisible even for the divine eyes, the golden threads of the magic network of Hephaestus waited, tense, like an animal stalking its prey. They had been placed with impeccable precision, so they would not leave escape when the time came. The network was not just a physical trap, it was a manifestation of the pain and fury of Hephaestus, a testimony of his ability to transform suffering into something tangible and devastating. Aphrodite, with her soft laugh and her lovely gaze, leaned towards Ares, whispering words that only he could hear. Ares, with his body forged in 1,000 battles, responded with an intensity that seemed to break the silence of the night. It was a perfect moment for them, an instant stolen to the time and judgment of others. But in Olympus, perfection always carried a price, and that night would not be the exception. At the precise moment that lovers joined, the Hephaestus network was activated. It emerged from nothing, like a ray in the dark, wrapping them in a relentless hug. The golden thread shone with a supernatural light, illuminating the room and revealing what until then had been a secret. Ares and Aphrodite were trapped, their bodies immobilized by the magic that permeated the network. They tried to move, fight her, but her efforts were useless. The network was unwavering, a divine creation designed to even submit to the most powerful gods. Surprise and confusion were reflected in their faces. Aphrodite, whose beauty could bend hearts, looked around with disbelief, as if he could not believe that he could catch her. Ares, accustomed to facing entire armies, roared of frustration, his pride injured more than his body. But no matter how much they fought, the network did not yield. The golden threads were adjusted more as they tried to free themselves, as if they feed on their resistance. And then, silence was made. A heavy silence, loaded with meaning, that filled the room while the lovers understood that they were completely at the mercy of who had laid the trap. The humiliation was palpable, especially for Ares, who had never been defeated in this way. Aphrodite, meanwhile, felt a mixture of fear and shame. He knew, in the depths of his being, who was behind the network, and that certainty filled her with a cold that nothing could calm. At that time, the camera doors opened, and Hephaestus entered. His figure, limping slightly, projected a long and threatening shadow under the light emanating from the network. He did not carry weapons or armor, I didn't need them. His presence, accompanied by the vengeful brightness in his eyes, was more than enough. He looked at trapped lovers, his crooked lips in a smile that was not of joy, but of bitter satisfaction. The silence in the room broke when Hephaestus spoke, his voice low but loaded with emotion. He did not yell or got carried away by his fury. Instead, his words were like hammer blows, slow and precise, each hitting where he hurt. He spoke of betrayal, of broken trust, how he had put his heart in Aphrodite just for her to destroy him. And while talking, Ares and Aphrodite could not look away, aware that they had been discovered and exposed as cruel as possible. The network, even shining with that golden light, became the center of attention. Hephaestus approached, touching her with her harsh hands of Herero, as if she were admiring her own masterpiece. Then, without looking away from lovers, he pronounced the words that would seal his destiny. "You have not only betrayed my trust," he said in a voice that seemed to contain all the fury of his soul, "but you have done it believing that there would be no consequences." The trap had worked perfectly, but the real impact of that night was yet to be revealed. In the Olympus, the secrets could not remain hidden for a long time, and Hephaestus knew that his next action would change forever the relations between the gods. But at that moment, while looking at Ares and Aphrodite trapped in his network, he did not think about the consequences. "I only thought about the momentary relief of having exposed the truth." The network shone with a blinding intensity, bathing the stay in a golden light that seemed to make fun of the darkness in which Ares and Aphrodite had tried to hide. At the moment of capture, everything stopped, the air, the sounds, even the time itself, as if the Olympus contained breathing before the scene that was about to reveal. The magical threads, forged with the anger and the pain of Hephaestus, wrapped lovers with cruel precision, marking the end of their secret and the beginning of their humiliation. Ares, the god of war, known by his strength and courage on the battlefield, twisted in vain against the bonds. The fury that burned in his chest was visible in each tense muscle, in every roar that escaped his throat. But no matter how much it fight, the network did not give in. It was a perfect trap, designed to contain even the most powerful deity. Impotence was a direct blow to his pride, a reminder that not all battles could earn with brute force. Aphrodite, on the other hand, seemed frozen. His beauty, the one that had seduced gods and mortals equally, now became a bitter contrast against his vulnerability. His eyes, usually full of charm and seduction, now reflected disbelief and fear. He had never imagined that something could catch her, that something could strip her of her freedom in that way. He tried to speak, pronounce words that could calm the situation, but his voice broke, unable to cross the weight of the moment. The initial silence was soon broken by the murmurs of the gods who, attracted by light and noise, began to congregate around the scene. One by one, the divine figures arrived at the place, observing with a mixture of amazement, curiosity and malicious delight. Zeus, with his severe gaze, crossed his arms and remained silent, letting the weight of the moment will speak for itself. Hera, always attentive to the alien drama, raised an eyebrow with a smile that did not bother to hide. Apollo, Athena, Dionysus. Everyone present delighted with the fall of the two most beautiful gods in such a humiliating trap. The murmurs grew, becoming acute, and laughter comments contained. Ares and Aphrodite, who previously walked through the Olympus with unwavering arrogance, were now the center of teasing and contempt looks. It was as if all the weight of the divine judgment fell on them at once. The Hephaestus network had not only caught them physically, he had also exposed them emotionally, stripping them of any trace of dignity. Hephaestus, limping towards the scene with the calm of someone who has expected this moment, stopped in front of them. His expression was difficult to read. It was not that of someone euphoric for his revenge, but that of a tired man, as if the burden of his pain had aged. He raised a hand, indicating silence, and the murmurs of the gods vanished. Everyone's attention focused on him, the god Hero who, despite his defects, had achieved the unthinkable. "Don't come here to celebrate," said Hephaestus, his voice echoing with a gravity that echoed in every corner of the room. "What is before you is not a victory. It is proof of betrayal, arrogance, and lack of respect." His gaze stuck in Ares, who kept fighting the network with the ferocity of a cornered animal. "You, the great god of war, you thought you could take what you wanted without consequences. That your strength made you untouchable. And now? Where is your power?" Then, Hephaestus directed his attention to Aphrodite. "And you, my wife, the goddess of beauty, who swore fidelity to the gods. What is left now? Your beauty? Your charm? None of them could save you this time." The words of Hephaestus fell like hammering, implacable, without leaving room for the replica. Ares and Aphrodite remained silent, trapped not only by the network, but also by the weight of shame. Their looks, previously full of trust, now desperately sought any corner to hide from the collective judgment. The gods continued to observe, their reactions oscillating between fun and bewilderment. For them, this was not just a tragedy, it was entertainment, an opportunity to see those who had ever been unattainable fall. Even those closest to Aphrodite and Ares could not help feeling a pinch of satisfaction to see that, for once, the powerful were subjected. But Hephaestus, although he had achieved his purpose, he did not feel victorious. While watching the two lovers trapped in their creation, a stab of something similar to guilt settled in his chest. He had demonstrated his point, but at what cost? The scene he had imagined so many times in his mind did not bring him the satisfaction he expected. Instead, he reminded him that pain did not dissipate with revenge, it only changed shape. The silence seized the place again when Hephaestus raised his hand again. His gaze toured the gods present, as if he wanted to make sure everyone understood the lesson. Then, without saying one more word, he turned and retired, leaving lovers trapped in the network of his own guilt and the gods immersed in the drama that he himself had unleashed. The moment of capture would be recorded in the memory of Olympus, not as a simple humiliation scene, but as a reminder that even the greatest gods could fall into the networks of pride, desire, and betrayal. The Olympus had never been so full of murmurs. The news extended as a fire. Ares and Aphrodite, the gods of desire and war, had been trapped in flagrant adultery, exposed in a magical network woven by the fury of Hephaestus. It was not simply a scandal, it was a revelation that shook the foundations of Olympus, where the secrets and betrayals often hid under a veil of apparent perfection. But this time, there was no way to hide anything. Hephaestus had decided to expose them, and would do it in the most ruthless way possible. With a solemn gesture, Hephaestus ordered that the network, even shining with its intense golden light, was transported to the great hall of Olympus, where all the gods gathered. There, under the heavenly vault and surrounded by immense columns of marble, Ares and Aphrodite were exhibited as fallen trophies. The threads of the network, impregnated with magic, not only immobilized their bodies, but also shone with an energy that seemed to underline every feature of its shame. Ares's muscular body, trapped like that of a helpless animal, an ethereal beauty from Aphrodite, now turned into a public show. The gods began to arrive at the room, each with a different expression. Zeus was one of the first in appearing, his face marked by a mixture of anger and resignation. Hera, always vigilant, could not help show a cunning smile. The drama among the gods was, after all, a show he enjoyed. Apollo arrived with a carefree elegance, although his eyes shone with the emotion of someone who knows that he is witnessing something memorable. Hermes, with his sharp ingenuity, already prepared comments that would make others laugh for weeks. Hephaestus, leaning on his blacksmith's cane, stood in front of the crowd. His presence, although less imposing than that of other gods, radiated an authority that no one dared to question. His voice, when he spoke, was firm and clear, echoing in every corner of the room. "Today, here, I expose a truth that many already suspected, but that nobody dared to mention," he said, pointing out the network that contained lovers. "Ares, the great god of war, and Aphrodite, my wife, have betrayed not only me, but to the order of Olympus himself. While we faced our responsibilities as gods, they enjoyed their lust in the shadows." The tension in the living room was palpable. The gods, although accustomed to the scandals, could not look away from the scene. Some, like Dionysus, contained laughter, while others, like Athena, looked disapprovingly. But all were fascinated. The fall of two of the most admired figures of Olympus was a show that they could not ignore. Ares, in a last attempt to save some dignity, spoke, his voice full of frustration. "This is a cowardly, Hephaestus." But Hephaestus did not flinch. He looked at him with a mixture of contempt and tiredness. "Do you think this is strength, Ares? This is not a battle. This is justice. And justice does not need muscles to be applied." Aphrodite, meanwhile, remained silent, her eyes stuck on the ground. It was evident that I was dealing with emotions that I did not know how to process: shame, anger, perhaps even repentance. Her beauty, which had always been her biggest weapon, now seemed unable to protect her from mockery and trial looks that surrounded her. When Hephaestus finished speaking, he made a gesture towards the network. "Here they are, exposed for everyone to see them. Not because I enjoy this humiliation, but because it is necessary. This serves as a reminder that even the gods are not above responsibility." The murmurs among the gods grew. Some argued who was right, if Hephaestus had gone too far or if Ares and Aphrodite had received what they deserved. Others simply enjoyed the show, delighting in the fall of two figures that had always been unattainable. Then, Zeus raised his hand, asking for silence. His gaze toured the living room, stopping in each of those involved. "This is enough," he said in his serious and authoritarian voice. "We have all made mistakes here. We have all yielded to our passions. But this scene, this public humiliation, it is not the way to solve our disputes. Hephaestus, frees prisoners." Hephaestus squeezed his teeth, clearly disagree, but did not dare to challenge Zeus. With a movement of his hand, the threads of the network began to disappear, dissolving in the air as if they had never existed. Ares and Aphrodite, now free, stood up, avoiding the looks of the other gods. The public exposure was over, but the emotional scars he left would not disappear so easily. Ares, with his shattered pride, and Aphrodite, with his reputation in ruins, left the living room in silence. Hephaestus, although he had achieved his revenge, did not feel the relief he had expected. And the gods, while returning to their own affairs, knew that this event would not be forgotten. In the Olympus, the wounds of pride and betrayal took a long time to heal. The Olympus, usually a place of intrigues and divine solemnity, was now flooded with laughter and murmurs. After the show offered by Hephaestus by exposing Ares and Aphrodite, the gods could not contain their reactions. It was as if the accumulated tension for centuries of secrets, disputes and rivalries found an escape valve in the humiliation of the two lovers. The columns resonated with laughter and ingenious comments, while the gods, large and small, discussed the details of the scene with a mixture of disbelief and rejoicing. "What more delicious irony!" Dionysus exclaimed, raising his glass of wine while offering a toast to those present. The god of war, caught as a mischievous child in the claws of the black blacksmith. And the goddess of love. "What a little elegant show for someone so sublime!" His laugh resonated throughout the room, spreading those around him. Hermes, always fast due with his tongue and ingenuity, he added with a mocking smile, Ares should have known that the speed on the battlefield would not save it from a magical network. Maybe I should start using his helmet to think, not just to fight. His words caused a burst of laughter among the gods, who did not miss the opportunity to mock the misfortune of others. Hera, although more reserved, enjoyed the moment discreetly. He watched the scene with a smile that he could barely contain. "Perhaps this teaches Aphrodite not to play with the honor of the marriage," said Demeter, who nodded with an expression mixture of disapproval and malicious pleasure. "Although, knowing her, I doubt that she changes her customs." Even Athena, known for her seriousness, could not avoid an acidic comment. "Love can be blind, but it seems that it is also reckless," he said, adjusting his helmet while looking at the gods with a spark of irony in his eyes. And to think that these two believed that they could challenge the order of Olympus without consequences. Meanwhile, Apollo, always elegant and charismatic, touched a mocking melody in his lyre, an improvised composition that sarcastically described the moment in which Ares and Aphrodite fell into the Hephaestus trap. The song was received with applause and laughter, quickly becoming the shopping of the day. "This will be an immortal masterpiece," he proclaimed, enjoying the enthusiasm of his listeners. However, not all gods shared the same enthusiasm. Poseidon, from his position in a corner of the room, watched with frown. "This scene is a shame for us," he murmured, heading to Hestia. "It should not be a reason for laughter. This weakens our authority in the face of mortals. If we ourselves are mocking, what respect can we demand from them?" Hestia, calm as always, responded serenity, "Maybe this is a reminder that even the gods can fall into human errors. But you are right, possess. The laughs will not last long, and when they go out, the echo of the humiliation and division." Meanwhile, Aphrodite and Ares, removed from public hearing, were aware of the uproar that their scandal had caused. Aphrodite felt the weight of each laugh, every malicious comment that floated in the air. His pride, carefully built for centuries as the most beautiful and influential goddess, had crumbled in an instant. Each mockery was a dagger that crossed its vanity. Ares, on the other hand, was full of anger. He did not support the idea of being the object of teasing, especially of gods that he considered inferior in strength and value. "This will not remain that way," Ares growled, his voice full of fury contained. "The same ones who now laugh at us will tremble when the time of war comes. I will not forget their words." Aphrodite, looking at his reflection in a adorned mirror, responded in a more off tone. "The war will not clean this stain, Ares. Laughs are more durable than battle screams. They have exposed us, and now we will be remembered for this, not for our greatness." Back in the main hall, the celebration continued. The minor gods imitated the scene of the magic network with an improvised theater, causing more laughs among those present. Zeus, although he had ordered the end of the exhibition, did not intervene in the reactions of the gods. He watched from his throne with a serious expression, letting the chaos follow his course. He knew that Olympus needed these moments of catharsis, but he was also aware that laughter could become deep resentments. Criticism also began to emerge among the most sensible gods. Some murmured that Hephaestus had gone too far to humiliate lovers in that way. Others questioned the hypocrisy of laughter, knowing that many of them had committed acts equally questionable in the past. The Olympus, always a place of lights and shadows, was divided between joy and discomfort. Laughter and teasing resonated in the heights, but in the darkest corners, the seeds of the great god of war, invincible on the battlefield, had been reduced to an object of mockery, caught as an animal by a simple trick. "This is intolerable!" Ares roared, hitting a column with such force that made the ground tremble. "Hephaestus made fun of me in front of everyone. In front of Zeus, in front of the damn minor gods. I will destroy it with my own hands. That coward does not deserve to breathe the same air as me." Aphrodite, sitting on a marble bank, did not respond immediately. His posture, normally relaxed and elegant, was now marked by unusual tension. He kept his eyes on the ground, his fingers playing with a strand of his golden hair nervously. For the first time in centuries, the goddess of love did not know how to use her beauty or her ingenuity to get out of the situation. The Hephaestus network had not only caught his body, but also his pride. "And what will you win with that, Ares?" He finally responded, his soft voice but full of bitterness. "Another war? More blood? Do you think violence can erase what we all saw today? It doesn't matter how much destroying, laughs will continue to resonate. Hephaestus has already won." Aphrodite's words hit Ares as an invisible spear. The rage on his face mixed with something deeper, something that rarely showed, vulnerability. Despite her fury, she knew she was right. I could not reverse what happened. The network had exposed more than its relationship, he had revealed that even he, the invincible god of war, had weaknesses. "And what do you suggest then?" Ares snapped, his lowest voice, but still loaded with tension. "What do we hide as mice while we all make fun of us? What do we accept this shame?" Aphrodite finally looked at him, his blue eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We cannot hide, Ares. But we cannot reduce at the level of Hephaestus. If we show weakness now, we will give you more reasons to laugh. We have to face this otherwise." Ares looked at her, confused. "What other ways? We are not like them. We are not like Hermes, with their ingenious words, or as Apollo, that transforms everything into a song. I fight. You love. What can we do against such a public mockery?" The question was floating in the air, while both plunged into their own thoughts. Ares, accustomed to solving everything with brute force, felt helpless. For his part, Aphrodite, always expert in handling the emotions of others, was now fighting his own. "What Hephaestus does not understand," said Aphrodite finally, his voice gaining strength, "is that our connection is not something that can break with a network or public humiliation. They can laugh at everything they want, but we know what it means." Ares looked up, surprised by passion in his words. "Do you think this is something we can use in our favor?" he asked, his voice now calmer, almost hopeful. Aphrodite nodded. "Yes. Hephaestus wanted to destroy us, but in doing so, it also made us more visible. More powerful, in a certain way. They laugh. That mutter. In the end, love and war always find a way to dominate everything. That will be ours answer." Ares watched her with a mixture of admiration and respect. In spite of everything, Aphrodite still retained that ability to transform an impossible situation into something I could control. She was love, but she was also cunning, a strategist in her own right. "So, we won't hide," Ares said, taking a long respite. "We will let them talk. They criticize. And in the meantime, we will expect. Because they don't understand what it means to be." Aphrodite dedicated a slight smile, one that contained both challenge and resignation. "Exactly. Let's let Hephaestus have his moment of glory. We will have the last." Both remained silent for a moment, each processing what they had just decided. It was not an immediate solution, nor was it a victory in the traditional sense. But it was something. It was a plan. And in Olympus, where tensions and conflicts never disappeared at all, knowing how to wait could be the most powerful strategy of all. The magic network of Hephaestus had disappeared, but the emotional wounds he left were still deep. Ares and Aphrodite, although marked by humiliation, were not defeated. While the Olympus continued to laugh, the two lovers prepared to face the scourge with the same intensity that characterized their passions. They knew that their relationship was dangerous, controversial, even foolish. But they also knew it was real. And in a world full of masks and appearanciers, that was enough to resist. In the days that followed public humiliation, Ares and Aphrodite found themselves walking on an emotional tightrope. Although the Hephaestus network had disappeared physically, the scars of their shame were still present in every corner of Olympus. The murmurs did not stop. Each conversation when it passed seemed to contain some veiled mention, each look carried a trace of mockery or pity. However, the most disturbing question did not come from others, but from themselves: could their relationship survive what they had faced? Ares, as was his nature, channeled his anger towards action. He gave himself to training with fierce intensity, destroying battle mannequins and shouting in the wind as if he could silence the laughter that still resonated in his mind. But war was an incomplete escape. Every time he lowered the sword or stopped throwing his spear, the void returned. The image of him caught, helpless, while the gods laughed, consumed it. "This is not living," he growled one night, while looking at the horizon from a cliff. "I am the god of war. I shouldn't feel this." Aphrodite, meanwhile, faced the situation with a different strategy. Although his heart was torn by humiliation, he decided to hold on to what he knew best to do: maintain his composure. He walked through the halls of the Olympus with his head high, his safe steps, his calculated smile. Every movement of his was a reminder that, despite everything, he was still the goddess of love and beauty. But behind that mask, its fragility grew. What is the use of beauty when they have turned it into a mockery object? He wondered while watching his reflection in a golden mirror. The worship I receive now is hollow. I see it in their eyes. They don't see me as before. And all this, for my own decision. The fault mixed with sadness, and in the darkest moments, he wondered if he had loved Ares was worth the price he was paying. Despite their differences, they both knew that they could not face this alone. One night, under a heaven of stars, they found themselves in a clear secret, far from Olympus, where no one could see them. Aphrodite was sitting in a rock, looking at the moon with a distant expression. Ares arrived shortly after, his heavy but determined steps. For a moment, none spoke. The silence between them was dense, full of emotions not expressed. "How are you?" Ares finally asked, breaking the barrier between them. It was not a typical question for him, but at that time, he sounded sincere. Aphrodite turned to look at him, surprised by the tone of his voice. "I am surviving," he replied, his soft voice but loaded with honesty. "And you?" Ares released a snort, crossing her arms while looking to the ground. "I've been better. I don't know how to deal with this. War, battle. I understand those things. But this..." He shook his head, frustrated. "This is killing me." Aphrodite nodded, perfectly understanding what he meant. "To me too. But we can't let them destroy us, Ares. If we do, Hephaestus will have really won." Ares looked up, her eyes looking for her. "So what do we do? Because I can't continue like this. I need to fight, but I can't fight this." Aphrodite got up, walking towards him. "Maybe we can't fight as we always do, but we can resist together. They want us to break, they want this to separate us. Don't give them that pleasure." "Resist together?" Ares repeated, his softer voice. "Do you think that's enough?" Aphrodite raised a hand, placing her delicate fingers on Ares's cheek. His contact was warm, comforting. "I don't know. But I prefer to try to face this alone." For the first time in days, Ares allowed his guard to fall. He closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh. "Me too," he murmured. "I can't do it alone." That moment of connection marked a change in both. Although the wounds were still open, they decided that they would not let the circumstances separate them. They supported each other, finding strength on their link. Ares, with his explosive temperament, learned to find comfort in Aphrodite's serenity. She, in turn, found value in her unwavering determination. Together, they began to walk through the Olympus again, facing the looks and murmurs with a new force. It was not that the criticism had disappeared, nor that the laughs had been extinguished. But when they were united, they sent a clear message: they would not apologize for what they were. They would not be ashamed of their love, or their mistakes. The Olympus, although noisy in its judgments, also had a limit. Little by little, the teasing began to decrease. The gods, always famine the new scandals, found other stories to comment. Ares and Aphrodite became a kind of awkward symbol, a reminder that even the gods could be vulnerable, but they could also be resilient. The relationship between them, although marked by scars, became deeper. They learned to love not only for their passion and attraction, but also for their ability to sustain each other in the darkest moments. It was a love that challenged not only the expectations of Olympus, but also his own. The forge of Hephaestus, usually a place full of rhythmic hammer sounds and the burning glow of molten metal, was in a disturbing silence. The blacksmith god, with his callous hands and his body marked by years of hard work, was sitting next to his anvil, with his eyes fixed on the coals that squeaked weakly. Although his creations used to reflect the greatness of the gods, now all he saw was an emptiness, an echo of the pain he felt. The Olympus still murmured about his revenge. For the other gods, the magical network he had used to catch Ares and Aphrodite was a sample of black ingenuity and humor. Some considered it a triumph, a way to put the two lovers in their place. But for Hephaestus, victory did not know sweet. He felt hollow, as if in the end he had only managed to deepen his own suffering. "Why did you choose me?" he murmured, his hoarse and broken voice, as if he were talking to the fire. "Why, if I gave everything for her?" The words drowned in the dense air of the forge, but the question kept turning in his mind. Hephaestus, the god despised for his appearance and limb, had always believed that his marriage to Aphrodite was an opportunity to demonstrate his value. He had worked tirelessly to create gifts, jewels and artifacts, trying to win the love that knew that she did not give her naturally. But love cannot forge as metal. That truth tormented him. Despite his best efforts, he had never managed to light a spark of true affection in Aphrodite. She had always been distant, like a brilliant and unattainable star. And now, that distance had been replaced by the abyss of deception. The image of Aphrodite and Ares trapped in his network pursued him, not as a triumph, but as an open wound. "I am not enough?" he thought, pressing his fists. The words, even if they said aloud, resonated in their mind as hammers. Hephaestus, the divine artisan, creator of wonders, had been relegated to the background in his wife's heart. Ares, with his arrogance and strength, had taken what he could never possess. The pain mixed with anger. Hephaestus hit the anvil with such force that the sparks flew in all directions. "He is not better than me," he roared, his voice reverberating on the stone walls. "All he has is violence and appearance. That is what love is worth it? Is that what I am for others, a shadow? I am the one who believes. Without me, their weapons would not exist, its palacios would be ruins. But that doesn't matter, right?" As the anger seized him, Hephaestus began to draw a plan in his mind. He had humiliated lovers publicly, yes, but he felt that was not enough. He had not calmed the sting of betrayal, nor had he filled the void he consumed him. Revenge had been a temporary balm, but his wound was still open. However, in moments of calm, anger gave in to pain. Hephaestus, despite everything, was still loving Aphrodite. It was a twisted love for frustration and disappointment, but a real love. "Why can't I love me as I love her?" he wondered again and again, knowing that there was no answer. Maybe that was what hurt him most, the impotence of loving someone who could never correspond to him. Hephaestus's vision of love began to transform. For him, love had always been an effort, something that could be won with sacrifice and dedication. But the reality he faced was cruel. Love did not follow the rules of logic, nor could it be manufactured, no matter how skillful the blacksmith was. That realization filled him with a deep sadness, a weight that even the gods would find difficult to carry. That night, while the fire of his forge slowly went out, Hephaestus allowed himself to cry in silence. His tears, hot like molten metal, fell on his trembling hands. there was no one to see him in his moment of vulnerability. He, the god of tools and the perfect creations, was unable to repair his own broken heart. At the bottom of his mind, an idea germinated. Maybe love was not destined for someone like him. Perhaps his place was in his creations, in his work, and not in the whims of the heart. But that resignation did not turn off to the little flame of hope that still burned, weak but persistent. Hephaestus knew that he could not force Aphrodite to love him, but he couldn't stop feeling what he felt. The Olympus continued to turn, indifferent to his pain. Hephaestus, caught between anger and sadness, wondered what way to take. Should I look for a new revenge, more devastating? Or should I try to find peace in your loneliness? The drafts of the forge were witnesses of their torment, but they did not offer answers. Meanwhile, love was still a mystery, a force that not even the most skilled artisans could fully understand. In the vast narrative of Greek mythology, the figure of Ares and Aphrodite emerges as a fascinating contrast, a union of apparently opposite forces. On the one hand, Ares, the god of war, represents brute force, violence and unbridled passion. On the other, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, embodies seduction, harmony, and the power of attraction. Together, they form a couple that awakens both admiration and controversy, a symbol of duality inherent in love and desire. Ares, with its impulsive character and its aggressive nature, has been portrayed in myths as an unstoppable force on the battlefield. It is not a calculating strategist as Athena, but a visceral warrior, moved by the most primary emotions, anger, pride, and desire for domination. However, in the relationship with Aphrodite, it shows a different side, more vulnerable. The passion he feels for her humanizes him in a way that few mythological stories allow. In his love for Aphrodite, Ares is not the god feared by mortals, but a being consumed by an attraction that dominates him as much as he dominates the battlefield. For its part, Aphrodite is presented as the very incarnation of desire and seduction. Its irresistible beauty not only captivates mortals, but also to gods. In his relationship with Ares, an Aphrodite is seen who challenges the conventions, a goddess who, despite being married to Hephaestus, follows the dictates of her heart and passion. This act of rebellion against established ties reflects a fundamental aspect of its nature: Aphrodite cannot be limited or chained, even by marriage. His love for Ares is not only a whim, but a manifestation of his freedom and his right to decide who to love. Greek mythology, always rich in nuances, does not present this relationship as something simple or idealized. On the contrary, the union of Ares and Aphrodite is loaded with contradictions. It is a relationship that combines attraction and conflict, beauty and brutality, love and betrayal. These tensions not only define their link, but also reflect broader aspects of the human condition. Ares and Aphrodite, in their duality, personify the complexities of love, which is often intertwined with desire, power, and vulnerability. A recurring element in myths is how this relationship affects the perception of both gods. Ares, known for its ferocity, shows a more emotional and less controlled facet when it is close to Aphrodite. This can be interpreted as a weakness, but also as proof that even the god of war can be conquered by the power of love. On the other hand, Aphrodite, always associated with harmony and beauty, reveals a darker and transgressive side in its adultery with Ares. Far from being a purely idealized figure, Aphrodite proves to be complex, with desires and decisions that place it in the center of a narrative loaded with consequences. The history of its relationship is also a reminder of social norms and tensions in ancient Greece. Ares and Aphrodite, breaking the limits established by marriage and divine hierarchies, become scandal figures. His adventure is not only a story of passion, but also of challenge to the imposed structures, something that surely resonated with the audiences of the time. Greek myths are rarely moralizing in the strict sense, rather, they present to the gods as reflections of humans, with all their defects, desires, and contradictions. Another significant aspect is how the children of Ares and Aphrodite, such as Eros and Harmonia, symbolize the consequences of their union. Eros, god of love and desire, embodies the transformative and often chaotic power of attraction, while Harmonia, the goddess of harmony, represents the balance that may arise from the opposite forces. These descendants show that even from a tumultuous relationship, fundamental aspects of human experience, from the most burning passion to the search for peace. The vision of the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite also varies according to artistic and literary interpretations over time. In many works, artists have emphasized sensuality and attraction between s, showing Aphrodite as the central figure that dominates Ares with her beauty and charm. In other stories, the vulnerability of both, trapped by emotions that cannot control. This diversity in representations reflects the wealth and ambiguity of myths, which allow multiple readings and meanings. Finally, the fact that their relationship has been immortalized in an episode of public humiliation when Hephaestus catches them in their magical network adds one more layer of complexity. Although this moment can be interpreted as a defeat, it also highlights the resistance of its connection. Despite the laughter of the other gods, Ares and Aphrodite remain united, their intact passion. This act of silent challenge shows that, ultimately, his love, although imperfect, is a force that cannot be annulled even by teasing and Clark. In Greek mythology, Ares and Aphrodite are not simply lovers. They are an eternal reminder that love and desire are uncontrollable forces, capable of challenging norms, transforming individuals, and revealing both the best and worst of ourselves. The forge of Olympus seemed to have cooled his fury, but the consequences of the scandal between Ares and Aphrodite still resonated in every corner of the divine kingdom. The incident that had exposed them publicly had not only humiliated lovers, but also had disrupted the delicate balance between love and war, two forces that they embodied. What had begun as a passionate and secret relationship now marked a before and after how both were perceived, both by the gods and by mortals. Ares, the god of war, returned to the battlefield with a fury that seemed inextinguishable. Before the incident, his ferocity was feared, but now his anger carried a different, more personal, more desperate nuance. Every blow he gave, every cry that roared in the middle of the battle, seemed to be directed not only to his enemies, but also to the mocking laughs of the gods who had observed him trapped and humiliated. His pride, his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, had been hit irremediably. However, something had changed in Ares beyond his fury. In the moments of calm between the battles, when the weapons rested and the blood dried, a shadow of introspection perched on it. Ares had never been a god known for his ability to reflect, but the pain of humiliation and intensity of his love for Aphrodite led him to question his own nature. Was it just an instrument of destruction? A symbol of meaningless chaos? Aphrodite, with his forbidden love, had shown him that there was something beyond violence, although that something was also complicated and heartbreaking. On the other hand, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, faced her own crisis. His influence on mortals and the gods remained powerful, but the scandal had left a stain in his image. For many, Aphrodite was still the irresistible figure of passion, but now they also saw her as a vulnerable goddess, capable of being trapped, exposed, and mocked. This duality, far from weakening it, added depth to its character. Aphrodite was aware that love was not always harmonious, it could also be dangerous, volatile, and sometimes humiliating. In his appearances among mortals, Aphrodite seemed to have acquired a new dimension. She was no longer just the goddess who inspired perfect romances and ideal loves. He also incarnated love in his most complex facets, the love he consumes, that hurts, that challenges the norms, and often mixes with pain. The mortals who prayed to her did it with a mixture of worship and empathy, because they saw in their history a reflection of their own struggles with desire and rejection. The relationship between Ares and Aphrodite, although marked by public humiliation, was not extinguished after the incident. His connection, far from weakening, seemed to have gained a renewed intensity. Ares, in its direct and visceral form, continued to go to Aphrodite in search of comfort, and she, in turn, found in him a passion that he could not find anywhere else. His encounters were less frequent and more careful, but every time they gathered, the spark that united them was still burning with the same force as before. The impact of the incident also felt on the balance of power between the gods. Hephaestus, although he had managed to take revenge on lovers, did not leave unscathed. His image as the artisan master of Olympus was stained by the cruelty of his revenge. Some gods applauded him for his ingenuity, but others saw him suspiciously, considering that he had crossed a line by exposing Ares and Aphrodite so brutal. Hephaestus' forge continued to produce wonders, but he seemed more isolated than ever, caught in his own pain. Among mortals, Ares and Aphrodite stories acquired their own life, such as warning and fascination stories. In the battlefields, the soldiers muttered the name of Ares more carefully, aware that God was more unpredictable than ever. In banquets and celebrations, poets sang on Aphrodite, describing it as a goddess capable of inspiring the purest love and the most devastating passion. The mythology that surrounded them was enriched with these new layers, making them symbols of the forces that shape the human world, struggle and love. In spite of everything, Ares and Aphrodite continued to be themselves. War and love, although different, had always been intertwined in intricate ways. Where there was conflict, there was also desire. Where there was passion, there could also be a confrontation. The relationship between the two gods encapsulated this paradox, showing that even in Olympus, love and war could not exist without the other. The Olympus, although apparently immutable, had changed after the incident. The gods were still powerful, immortal and irresistible, but the story of Ares and Aphrodite had left an indelible brand. He remembered all that even the most divine forces were not immune to suffering, humiliation, and unwavering ties of love and passion. And while Ares raised his spear on the battlefield and Aphrodite inspired the hearts of lovers, they both knew that, deep down, their connection was as indestructible as complicated. The wind blows strongly in the corners of Olympus, but no storm was as fierce as the one that broke out between Ares and Aphrodite. Through their hearts, love had sneaked into an invisible snake, catching them in a bond they could not escape. It didn't matter how intensely they would fight against him. It was a burning, dangerous and visceral love, like the fire that consumes everything in its path, without asking permission, without warnings. Ares, the god of war, and Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and desire, had been consumed by something that not even the gods could control, such an overwhelming passion that overflowed all the limits established by Olympus himself. There was never space for serenity in their relationship. Each encounter between them was a storm, a whirlwind of emotions and desires that left behind a trail of chaos. For Ares, the war had always been a manifestation of its nature, a field where victory was achieved with blood and fire. However, next to Aphrodite, that same force of fighting and desire took a different form. It was no longer only the fight in the battlefields that defined it, but the fight within its own being. His love for Aphrodite overflowed him, led him to frenzy limits that he didn't even understand. Aphrodite, meanwhile, had never been a goddess to submit to the rules. Since her birth, she had been a natural force, a flash of light and beauty capable of breaking any will. But when the love for Ares was lit on his chest, that freedom, so typical of his being, became something uncontrollable. Every time his eyes were those of Ares, it was as if the whole world disappeared. Nothing else mattered. Nor the fact that her husband, Hephaestus, was in the Olympus, or the consequences of her forbidden love. Everything was reduced to a passion that could not be contained, like an overflowing river that drags everything in its path. This love, uncontrollable and dangerous, transformed both into something they were no longer. Ares, the dreaded god of war, was helpless in the face of Aphrodite's seduction. In his hug, the fight lost its meaning, the combat was replaced by a delivery that stripped him of his warrior nature. Aphrodite, on the other hand, discovered in Ares a brutal force that could not bend. Although her beauty was her greatest power, with Ares she felt vulnerable, because he overflowed her, dragged her to a passion she could not escape. Together, they were like two forces of nature that were, but they could not coexist without destroying each other. The story of his love was not only dangerous for them, but for everything that surrounded them. The relationship between Ares and Aphrodite was not a simple romance, it was a link that upset Olympus's own balance. The gods, observing from their distant height, understood that this love was somewhat bigger than a simple adventure. It was a reflection of the duality of the world, the desire that cannot be content and the war that consumes everything that touches. In their union, Ares and Aphrodite personified instability itself, and his love, instead of bringing peace, only sowed more chaos. However, what made this love even more dangerous was not only the passion that fed it, but the irreversibility of its consequences. It was not only an adulterous relationship or a divine whim, it was a force that transformed everything around him. Someone like Ares, so accustomed to struggle, and someone like Aphrodite, who had spent their existence in the harmony of love, had been trapped by something much bigger than them. What began as an unstoppable desire became a need, the desire for a love that only existed in its terms, without restrictions, without morality, without limits. And despite all the chaos that their love caused, they could not stop looking. In the heat of the battle, Ares saw Aphrodite's face, and in the stillness of his palace, Aphrodite felt the war of Ares throbbing in his chest. It was as if the love between them was the center of the universe, the cause and the end of everything. There was no escape from his fire or his flames, although both knew that love would burn them inside. This love became a reflection of the contradictions of Olympus himself. The gods, despite their immortality, were not oblivious to the suffering that can cause uncontrollable love. Even in the beauty and perfection of its existence, Ares and Aphrodite showed that no divinity could escape human passions. His love was, deep down, a manifestation of the most raw and real of life itself, desire, struggle, surrender, and despair that accompanies those who give themselves completely to something they cannot control. It was a love that raised them, but at the same time made them vulnerable. A love that, although it gave them moments of ecstasy and perfection, also dragged them towards destruction. The beauty of Aphrodite and the ferocity of Ares mixed in a dangerous dance, an endless cycle of attraction and repulsion, passion and struggle. And although their hearts could not be avoided, their destinations were irremediably marked by force itself that united them. This love was a reminder, not only for the gods, but for mortals, that true love, the one that consumes and does not know of limits, is the most uncontrollable force that exists in the universe. And although Ares and Aphrodite knew that they could not escape what they felt, deep down they knew they would never find peace while their hearts continued to beat with the intensity of a fire that could not be off. Olympus's air was heavy, as if the same sky feared what was about to unleash. Revenge, that gloomy and fearsome force, seemed to whisper in the shadows of the gods, willing to collect what belonged to him. In the divine world, justice was not a simple matter of balance. Revenge, with his bleak face and his cold gaze, ruled with a firm and ruthless hand. The gods, immortal and impartial in their nature, knew that revenge was an intrinsic part of their existence. Sometimes, more than goodness or forgiveness, the anger of an injured god needed to be satisfied with blood, with suffering, with the humiliation of those who dared to challenge the established order. Greek mythology is no stranger to revenge. In fact, it is impossible to talk about the gods without mentioning their dark impulses for retribution. In a kingdom where conflicts and disputes between deities were common, revenge became a way of doing justice, to restore balance, although it often left deep scars in the heart of the Olympus. No one was safe from its consequences. Even the most powerful fell into their trap, trapped by the same fury as they unleashed. In the case of Hephaestus, the foregone god, revenge had come as a personal need, a desire to balance the pain he felt after the public humiliation of his wife Aphrodite and his lover Ares. But in his heart, revenge not only had a purpose of justice, but to reaffirm his own worth. Hephaestus, who had always been considered the most underestimated god, the farthest from the glories of Olympus, found in his revenge a way to demonstrate his power. In their forge, where the flames purified the metal and the hammer forged fate, a network was born that would catch not only the bodies, but also the souls of the traitors. What Hephaestus did not know was that revenge, no matter how much he seems to bring comfort in his pain, he would only immerse him in a spiral of resentment and distrust. Throughout Greek mythology, revenge has a double nature, and often those who seek revenge end up falling into their own traps. The feeling of having won a battle rarely brought true peace. In the background, revenge did not heal the pain of Hephaestus, but only perpetuated him, kept him trapped in an endless cycle of anger and repentance. Revenge in Greek mythology also has a symbolic role, representing the constant struggle between justice and passion, between order and chaos. The gods, although immortal, could not escape human emotions. Throughout the stories, revenge is presented as a force that knows no limits, which feeds on anger, disdain, and contempt. It is a cycle of suffering, where those that cause pain end, sooner or later, suffering it too. Mortals that challenge the gods or commit wicked acts often suffer devastating punishments, while the gods, in their fury, unleash punishment storms in an attempt to restore their own sense of justice. But revenge is not only limited to the gods. The heroes are also victims of this powerful strength. In Greek tragedies, revenge plays a crucial role in the destiny of the protagonists, who are dragged by the consequences of their own decisions. The desire to take revenge on an offense can consume them, leading them to commit acts that finally destroy them. Thus, revenge becomes a constant lesson. Even the greatest can fall before their own remuneration. In the case of Hephaestus, the revenge that planned was both a release and a conviction. By capturing Aphrodite and Ares on his network, he felt that he could finally restore his dignity, which he could put those two in his place, humiliate them as they had humiliated him. But at the same time, his heart was still a battlefield. Despite the justice he thought he had achieved, something inside him was still burning. Revenge did not give peace, and no matter how much he made fun of his trapped enemies, Hephaestus never recovered the harmony he had lost. Pain and fury continued, because revenge, although sweet at the time, only leaves empty. Revenge in mythology not only seeks justice. It is also a reminder of the fragile that are even the gods before the power of human emotions. The gods of Olympus, although superior in many ways, were prisoners of the same passions and desires as mortals. The story of Hephaestus, Ares, and Aphrodite is a reflection of this eternal cycle. The gods are not immune to pain, anger, or the need for remuneration, and revenge, like everything in Olympus, is a double-edged sword. It is sought, fight for her, but the result is rarely enjoyed. Therefore, in Greek mythology, revenge is presented as an inevitable and destructive force, which not only punishes the culprits, but to drag everyone involved, immersing them in a maze of suffering and repentance. The gods, in their infinite greatness, become a mirror of humans, reflecting their own passions and falls. And while Hephaestus forged his network, Olympus continued his course, knowing that, as in every story of revenge, the only thing that was guaranteed was that no one would be intact. Hephaestus was alone in his workshop, surrounded by the forges and metals that had once been his refuge and passion. The sound of the hammer on the anvil no longer had the same force as before. He had forged innumerable weapons, but now, in his solitude, he wondered if he had really forged something that was worth it. The brightness of fire in his forge illuminated the shadows of his heart, where sadness and anger were intertwined. His mind could not free himself from the memory of public humiliation, from revenge he had sought with such fierceness and the consequences that had followed her. The network he had created, that magical trap that had caught Ares and Aphrodite, no longer brought him satisfaction. At first, he thought that justice had been served, which somehow had restored his honor and dignity. But as time passed, something began to break inside him. The echo of the laughter of the gods continued to resonate in their mind, but it was not just the sound of mockery that tormented it. It was the emptiness of what he had achieved. Revenge, that burning desire that his soul had consumed, no longer offered him the peace he expected. Instead of justice, I had found an even greater vacuum, a sadness that only the passage of the days could amplify. The look of Hephaestus, once full of fire and determination, had become bleak. Throughout its existence, it had always been the god of creation, the architect of wonders, the forge of the most powerful weapons and the most beautiful objects of Olympus. But now, when facing his own pain, he wondered if he had really created some value. His ability to mold the metal had been his strength, but he had not prepared it for the fragility of his heart, or for the cruel truth that revenge did not heal the wounds of the soul. At first, he thought that his only option was to move on, continue forging, continue creating. But as the darkness of his pain seized him, he understood that, no matter how much he worked, nothing could fill that void. Revenge had destroyed something inside him, something that could never be restored with hammers or forge. And so, the truth began to after Rar, the pain of betrayal and humiliation could only be healed with something that he could not forge with his own hands. Hephaestus' pain was that of a man who had given everything for love and had received only pain in return. In his heart, there was a scar that he could not repair. Creation, as powerful as it was, could not return what I had lost. And then, in that empty space, acceptance was born. Not an acceptance of his destiny, but an acceptance of his humanity, of his vulnerability as divine being. In some corner of his being, he understood that revenge could not return the peace he had lost, that forgiveness, both towards others and towards himself, was the only thing that could really break the chains of his suffering. The redemption of Hephaestus did not come in the form of great deeds or heroic sacrifices. There were no great battles or victories. The redemption of Hephaestus came at the time he allowed his pain to transform, when he understood that he only facing his own suffering could find a way of freeing himself. The acceptance of his destiny was his first step towards inner peace. He did not have to be the god of revenge or the god who forgave everything, but simply a god who had learned to live with his own scars. Over the centuries, Hephaestus had witnessed the ups and downs of Olympus, love and betrayals, wars and alliances. But there was something that I had ever understood at all: the true strength is not in the ability to destroy or take revenge, but in the courage to accept what cannot be changed. Life had not given him the opportunity to be the hero who always imagined being, but perhaps, in his humility and acceptance, he found a new form of redemption. At that time of reflection, Hephaestus understood that creation was not only a matter of shaping metal, but to shape one's life. Each of us, in their pain and their struggle, has the ability to transform. The forge, who had always been his sanctuary, now offered him a new understanding, that of being an architect of his own destiny. Revenge was no longer his engine, or justice that guided him. Now, it was the acceptance of himself, his pain and his humanity, which defined it. From that moment, Hephaestus stopped seeing his suffering as a burden, and began to see him as a necessary part of his trip. He knew that the scars would always be there, but he also understood that those scars had molded him, they had done who he was. The forge, which had previously been a place of creation for others, became a place of healing for him. Each hammer blow was not only an action, but a step towards inner peace. And through his acceptance, Hephaestus found something he had never imagined: the true redemption, the one that comes not from revenge, but of forgiveness and peace with himself. Thus, in the silence of his workshop, surrounded by metals and fire, Hephaestus let the light of understanding illuminate his soul, knowing that, in the end, the fate of a god, like that of any being, is not determined by his ability to punish, but for your ability to heal. The Olympus, immense and brilliant, seemed calm, as if their gods had finally reconciled with the echoes of a tragedy that had marked their lives. The air, previously loaded with anger and resentment, now breathed a slight serenity, as if the skies themselves decided to give a break to those who inhabited their dwelling. However, peace does not always come without warning. After the public humiliation of Ares and Aphrodite, and the devastating revenge of Hephaestus, something deep had changed between them. The betrayal, that wound that had been inflicted in the heart of Olympus, could not simply be erased over time. The need for redemption, of an answer rather than the conviction, was evident. The gods, although immortal, could not ignore the pain that each of them carried. The betrayal had not only affected Hephaestus, but had left scars in all those who witnessed humiliation. Ares, the god of war, was no stranger to the damage caused by anger, but this time, the war was not in the battlefields or in the hearts of mortals. This time, the battle was internal. The guilt consumed him, even if he did not admit it out loud. He was a god feared by his strength, by his fierceness, but none of that prepared him for the humiliation he had suffered, nor for the lessons that life had taught him through the pain of his own betrayal. He, who had always managed to handle steel, now faced a much more difficult enemy to fight: his own remorse. Aphrodite, on the other hand, looked at Olympus from his watchtower, his intact beauty, but his heart marked by a painful lesson. Had it was the search for pleasure that there was evoked to betrayal, or simply the need to feel desired? In his immortality, he had experienced thousands of loves, but something had changed in it that day. The network of Hephaestus, the public humiliation, the eyes of all the gods looking at his fault, showed him a face of herself that she had never wanted to see. And yet, there was facing the truth of his actions. Love and desire, although powerful, could be equally destructive, and that truth now burned in his chest with unusual intensity. Forgiveness, such a distant word for the gods, began to acquire a deep meaning at that time. It was not only a release of the feelings of anger or revenge, but of something more complex, something that overflowed understanding. Forgiveness was not a simple reconciliation, it was a deep acceptance of the imperfections of oneself and others. For the gods, whose ego and power were almost infinite, forgiving involved recognizing their own vulnerability, something they had never experienced so palpably. Hephaestus, who had been the architect of revenge, finally understood that his suffering was not only caused by the betrayal of others, but by his own inability to free himself from his own pain. Forgiveness not only had to come from others, but from himself. At first, it seemed that forgiving meant weakness, that granting forgiveness was like giving in to the unfair. But over time, he realized that, by refusing to forgive, he only perpetuated his own suffering. By accepting that revenge had only fed the fire of his anger, he began to see forgiveness as a way of freeing himself. Forgiving did not mean, or accept injustice, but to cease to be a prisoner of the destructive emotions that had consumed it. The resolution of the conflict was not a great ceremony or a forgiveness proclaimed first of all Olympus. It was a quieter act, an internal reflection, a step towards healing. The gods, in the end, understood that their immortality did not make them immune to pain, and that absolute power did not free them from the wounds of the heart. Instead of maintaining their pride, they chose to seek peace. Ares, with its warrior nature, learned to be more reflective and less impulsive. Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, understood that love was not always a game, and that desire without respect could lead to destruction. Hephaestus, meanwhile, understood that true strength lies in the ability to heal and forgive, not in revenge. The forgiveness of the gods did not mean that the scars disappear. No one forgot what happened, and the lessons learned did not vanish. But there was a change. Olympus, so full of struggles and passions, was able to embrace his own imperfections. The betrayal was no longer the only memory that remained, but also the understanding that, even in their darkest moments, the gods could find the way to redemption. Because, in the end, the true wisdom of the gods was not in their possession, but in their ability to forgive, to heal and learn from suffering. The resolution of the conflict between Ares, Aphrodite and Hephaestus was only the beginning of a larger process, that of the understanding of human nature that the gods had never completely considered. And although Olympus would remain a place of intense passions and immeasurable powers, something had changed. They were no longer just invincible gods. Now they were also beings able to face their own mistakes, to forgive and, most importantly, to move forward, with humility, with love, and with a wisdom that only suffering could grant. Ares and Aphrodite, two of the most powerful and contrasting gods of Olympus, not only wove their destinations in the dwelling of the gods, but their presence is also felt in the life of mortals. His influences were not only of fear and veneration, but also of love and struggle. While Ares represented the brutality of war, the struggle for power and supremacy, Aphrodite embodied the beauty of love, desire, and connection between human beings. These gods were not simple mythical figures that were confined in the stories of Olympus, but their essence was leaked in the deadly world, becoming an essential part of the daily life of men and women. Mortals, always eager to understand the world that surrounded them and the mysteries that governed him, looked at Ares and Aphrodite as forces with an irresistible power. Ares was worshipped by those who saw war as the way to glory, by the warriors who longed for victory, and by the kings who wanted to expand their empires. In the battlefields, Ares was the god who inspired courage, but also violence. Although his cult was not as widespread as that of other gods, his figure was essential in conflict times. The cities that were at war made sacrifices in their honor, asking for their favor to get victorious. Ares was not a kind god, and his cult reflected that fierce and destructive aspect. But there was something fascinating in his possession, something that attracted men to him even through fear. On the other hand, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty and desire, had a much broader and deeper cult among mortals. Its influence was not limited only to the physical or emotional field, but it touched the most spiritual spheres of the human being. The lovers, the couples, the women who wanted to be mothers or those who longed to be desired, turned to it in search of favors and protection. The temples dedicated to Aphrodite stood in many Greek cities, and their festivities were occasions full of joy, dance and offerings. People venerated it not only for its superficial beauty, but for its ability to inspire love in all its forms: romantic love, filial love, love towards nature and creation. However, Aphrodite's influence also had a gloomy side, as humans could attest. Love, that force that seemed so sublime, could be equally destructive, throwing mortals in uncontrolled passions, jealousy, and suffering. Aphrodite not only granted happiness and pleasure, but also left ruptures and broken hearts. Aphrodite cult reflected this dualism. Love could be a heavenly gift, but also a flame that burned mercilessly. Despite their differences, Ares and Aphrodite had something in common. Both represented intense human forces that could not be contained or easily understood. Mortals felt that, in some way, their lives were connected to the gods. When Ares unleashed in fury on the battlefields, men felt that war was not only his, but was impregnated with the will of a god who was as uncontrollable as the war itself. When Aphrodite inspired love in two souls, mortals felt that not only their hearts were intertwined, but that their destinations were united by a divine force. In addition, Ares and Aphrodite influenced the politics and culture of cities. Many warriors, like the kings, used to offer sacrifices to Ares before leaving for battles. The gods were asked to protect the soldiers and grant them the necessary force to defeat their enemies. Ares was revered in times of war, but also, curiously, his cult flourished during peace times, since it was thought that he could also give the courage necessary to face everyday difficulties. As for Aphrodite, his cult was mixed with fertility rituals and celebrations that honored beauty and harmony. His influence was in the air, in the relationship between men and women, in creation and desire, which shaped the world. The myths about Ares and Aphrodite were not only stories of gods, but also what it meant to be human. The mortals, with their passions, desires, and struggles, saw in them reflections of themselves. Ares, with his war and violence, showed what happened when anger overflowed, when the desire to be able to seize reason. Aphrodite, with her beauty and her love, taught that love could be the most sublime and most destructive. Mortals were not only attracted to these deities, but they saw them as a mirror of their own yearnings and weaknesses. In the homes of humans, Aphrodite statues were often placed, seeking to attract his blessing, or Ares, waiting for his favor in battle times. His presence in the deadly world never disappeared. The sacrifices were offerings not only to the gods, but to the deepest desires of humans, those who resonated beyond reason. And so, Ares and Aphrodite, although distant in their natures, continued to be fundamental figures in the life of mortals, with their passions and desires reflected in the lives of those who adored them, creating an eternal bond between heaven and earth. When the rumble of war drums filled the air and the sound of steel crashing against steel resonated along the battlefields, mortals knew that Ares was present. He did not look with human eyes, nor manifested with a tangible body, but its essence, its indomitable power, floated in the environment, invading the earth as an imposing shadow. The god of war, the fury personified, seized the mind and heart of the warriors, dragging them into a frenzy of violence and conquests. Ares was not a god who sat comfortably at Olympus to contemplate wars. He was part of the battle itself, in his most chaotic and bloodthirsty moments. The heroes, those warriors for glory and death, they invoked him before throwing himself into combat, waiting for his favor, his rabies unleashed, to snatch the victory. It was the god who inspired the desire for struggle, but also the one who fed despair, blind fury, the need to destroy. In the heat of battles, Ares became an uncontrollable force. The warriors often did not know if they struggled for their homeland, their honor, or for glory. What guided them was something more visceral, something essential that was born from the bowels, the desire to beat, to knock down the enemy, to demonstrate that they could survive in that field where life and death were confused. Ares whispered in his ear, infused them with terrible courage, and made them feel invincible, as if they were immortal. But in that fury, he also dragged them towards their own perdition. Ares did not distinguish between fair and unfair. For him, war was a natural extension of his being. For mortals, war represented sacrifice, suffering and, often, the loss of everything they loved. But for Ares, there was no such concept of suffering. The war was simply its nature, its reason for the existing. Brutality was his language, and death, his constant partner. The side of the war did not matter, nor the value of the cause. If there was battle, there were Ares, creating chaos and destruction, like a wind that sweeps everything in its path. However, despite his omnipresence in conflicts, Ares was not always a god loved by humans. While many adored him and invoked him for his power, there were also those who feared him, who knew that his presence only brought suffering and despair. The poets and artists described him as a ruthless god, always anxious to shed blood, while the heroes saw him as an essential ally in the struggle for glory. But for those who were left behind, who lost their loved ones in the war, Ares was not a god of admiration, but of condemnation. War did not bring peace or solutions, only more death and pain. Ares, in his role as god of war, not only limited himself to inspiring the fighting, but was also present in the most decisive moments of the great battles. In mythology, he was next to the great heroes, such as Achilles and Hector, influencing their decisions, giving them strength and courage, but also pushing them towards the tragedy. He was a capricious god who decided the fate of the warriors without them being able to do anything to avoid it. Some fighters fell in their favor, others to their disdain, depending on the capricious decisions of Ares. Some myths reported that Ares delighted in the pain of the fighters, observing from the shadows of the war, enjoying suffering and spilled blood. He was a god who did not stop at anything, not even before the supplications of those who wanted peace. In his world, there was no place for the truce. The war was an eternal cycle, and Ares was his eternal commander. It was the chaos that governed the battles, the brute force that pushed the warriors to a fatal outcome. However, Ares also had his most fervent followers, those who saw in him the incarnation of the supreme force. For them, war was the way to eternal glory, and Ares the god who showed them the way. Warriors who threw themselves into combat with the firm belief that their name would be remembered by future generations, that their actions would be sung by the poets, that their victories would be eternal. For them, Ares was the incarnation of everything that meant power, honor and struggle. But God did not give favors in a simple way. Ares could be capricious, to change the side without prior notice, and leave his abandoned followers in desolation. The war, under its influence, was not a means to achieve peace, but an endless cycle of violence, where each victory brought with it a new struggle, a new battle. Those who had fallen fighting in their name did not always receive the expected tribute, because in Ares's mind, the heroes were only pieces on a board, and the war followed their course, regardless of how many they fell. The influence of Ares in the war was not only limited to the battlefields, but their traces were seen in every corner of Greek civilization. The generals, the soldiers, the conquerors, all felt their power. Even in peace times, war was not completely absent. The Greek culture was impregnated by the need to conquer, to expand, to submit, to fight for honor and glory. And all that humans wanted in their ambition for power, had the face and breath of Ares. But the war, in its purest form, did not bring peace, and Ares, on his throne, never ceased to be the god of conflict, the god of destruction. In his eyes there was no mercy, just a vacuum that fed from chaos and death. And while mortal fell in his name, Ares continued, indifferent, witnessing suffering as if it were his own creation, a constant dance of blood, hate, and fury. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, not only represented an ideal of what it meant to be loved, but also became the very extent of what was considered beautiful in ancient Greece. She was the incarnation of harmony, softness, and seduction. His presence walked every corner of the Greek world, from the temples dedicated to it, to the hearts of mortals that, without knowing it, adored beauty in all its forms, looking for some of its essence. In Greek cities, Aphrodite was not only worshipped by mortals, but also reflected in everyday culture. The idea of physical beauty was closely linked to her. The women struggled to emulate their perfect figure, their soft features, and their infinite grace. It was not only the body that defined its beauty, but also the grace with which it moved around the world, that ability to fall in love without effort, to make everything that touched be filled with harmony. The poets and sculptors, those creators of beauty, saw it as the supreme muse. In his verses and statues, Aphrodite lived, beyond words, as a symbol of what mortals aspired to be. But Aphrodite's influence on beauty concepts went beyond the physical. She also represented the beauty of the soul, the deep desire that was experienced by knowing another human being in all its entirety. In his ability to inspire love, Aphrodite touched the hearts and made them burn in an eternal desire. His power was such that love could cloud reason, drag mortals to irrational, and sometimes destructive behaviors. Love and desire, in its purest form, could be more powerful than any other force. Aphrodite, by giving this gift, turned mortals into creatures who could not escape their own passion. The stories about Aphrodite were full of love, yes, but also of the storm that brought with him. His relationship with Ares, for example, not only showed the beauty of desire, but also the destruction it could cause. His adultery with the god of war, Ares, was not only a reflection of the fascination with forbidden love, but also a reminder of what desire could trigger: tragedy, infidelity, and rupture of sacred ties. Aphrodite, with its immense power, overflowed the concept of idealized love and led it to darker and more complicated land. In myths, Aphrodite's power was not only physical, but extended to the very heart of mortals. She had the ability to make the most brave men crumble for love, or that the most powerful gods became vulnerable. Who did not fall under his spell? Who did not want, even if it were only for a moment, to feel that deep connection with another being? Aphrodite's beauty not only made mortals venerate her, but also reminded them of how fragile and human that could be. His power transcended superficial beauty and touched the deepest of his darkest and secret desires. The ancient Greeks, deeply connected to their love for aesthetics, saw in Aphrodite a symbol of perfect beauty, a beauty that was both divine and earthly. In sculptures and paintings, women and men struggled to emulate the ideal proportions that Aphrodite represented. Perfection was not only on his face, but in his way of being, in how he related to others, how the world was shown, a warm and radiant presence, which attracted everything that was on his way. The Greeks saw in it the ideal of what it meant to be beautiful, and beauty, for them, it was not only something aesthetic, but something that could also move the soul. Aphrodite not only influenced art and poetry, but also in human behavior. In ancient Greece, love was not just a feeling, but a force that linked people, societies, and cultures. Aphrodite taught that love could arise in the most unexpected situations, and that its power could even transform even the darkest circumstances into something bright. However, love, as the goddess taught, was not just a state of happiness and ecstasy. Love could be contradictory and conflictive, as capable of building as destroying. At the same moment that a passion was born, he could also die. And so, in the hearts of mortals, Aphrodite's love never remained still, always in motion, always overflowing the limits of reason. The festivities in his honor were occasions of great joy and celebration. At that time, people gave themselves to the pleasures of love and desire, without reservations or regrets. Love was not only celebrated among men and women, but also among friends, families, and communities. Aphrodite taught mortals that love was not something that should be limited to the romantic couple, but something that should be shared with everyone. At the moment, beauty was not only in the physical, but in the gestures of goodness, in the generosity of spirit, and in the unity of people. In the end, Aphrodite taught that love, in its purest form, was not only a superficial feeling or a selfish search for pleasure, but something much deeper. It was a link that connected human beings with each other, that transcended time and space. Beauty, as Aphrodite saw her, was not only something to admire, but something to live and share. In their influence, mortals understood that love could be both a gift and a lesson, something that everyone wanted to experience and that, at the same time, could change them forever. Aphrodite was the goddess who made the world fill with love and beauty, a love that was not limited to the physical, but rather touched souls, united them, transformed them. And in his name, humanity celebrated the eternal power of love, the one who, like her, never died. In Greek literature, passion was not a trivial or ephemeral concept, but an overflowing force that dragged mortals and gods equally. Ares and Aphrodite, as living symbols of this passion, are erected as the most complex and emotional characters in myths, representing both love and unbridled fury that accompanies these feelings. The relationship between the two was not only a recurring theme, but a manifestation of how the Greeks saw the intensity of human emotions, uncontrollable, transformative and, sometimes, destructive. Ares, god of war, embodied the most destructive passion of all, the war itself. For him, the battle was not only a means to achieve power, but a passion that consumed it. The desire to fight, to conquer, to submit, was not just a matter of honor or justice, it was a visceral impulse that was born from the bowels. The stories in which Ares participates reveal that his passion did not distinguish between the good and the bad, but that it was a primary force that dragged all those involved to a state of frenzy. In the war, there was no place for reflection or moderation, only raw emotion, the excitation of combat, the desire to overcome, the need to destroy the enemy. Ares did not stop at anything, the passion that ruled him pushed him towards violence without regrets. But next to him, Aphrodite represented a completely different passion, love, desire, irresistible attraction between two souls. Beauty and love were, for her, more than a simple physical pleasure, they were the force that moved the world, the force that maintained order in nature. However, although his love seemed to be softer than Ares's fury, his influence on mortals and the gods was no less intense. Aphrodite not only evoked romantic love, but also the passion that was born of beauty, seduction, and the deep connection between human beings. His power was in the ability to create unwavering ties, to make gods and mortals kneel against love, giving themselves without reservations. In Greek literature, the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite appears as a representation of the two sides of passion. If Ares takes passion to the field of war, of the conflict, Aphrodite takes her to the field of beauty, of the most intimate and transformative emotion. The poets, from Homer to the tragic ones, saw in these two gods the complexity of human love and passion. A love that not only exalted the beauty of the bodies, but also brought tragedy and suffering, as demonstrated Troy. The myths that surround Ares and Aphrodite are not only stories about infidelities and jealousy, but about the uncontrollable power of the passion of transforming and dragging. In the Iliad, and in other epic works, the gods are not distant figures that observe humanity from their heavenly pedestal. They are, on the other hand, beings that are trapped by their own passions, which are delivered to them with the same strength and vulnerability as any mortal. In this sense, Ares and Aphrodite not only personify the extremes of passion, but also reflect the chaos that can generate unbridled desire, either on the battlefield or in the heart of a lover. The contrast between them, however, is equally revealing. The relationship they maintain, marked by infidelity and transgression, reflects how passion can be both destructive and creative. Ares, on the other hand, is not a god who seeks beauty or harmony. His vision of passion is chaotic and fierce, a continuous exercise of power and domination. Aphrodite, on the other hand, sees the passion as an act of union, connection between beings. While Ares feeds on struggle and violence, Aphrodite seeks to create ties that are sometimes not only harmonious, but also dangerous, just like love can be sweet, but also bitter and painful. The vision of passion in Greek literature looks complex and ambiguous through these two gods. Passion, for the Greeks, was not something that could be reduced to a simple emotion. It was a concept full of contradictions. It could be a source of beauty and life, such as the love that Aphrodite inspired, but it could also be the seed of death and destruction, such as the wars that Ares unleashed. Both gods were irresistible, but their influence on mortals and the gods themselves was marked by a high price. Those who succumbed to their passions were irremediably trapped in their own emotions, whether in the heat of love or in the fury of war. Greek tragic, such as Sophocles and Euripides, understood that passion, whether loving or warrior, could not be controlled. Often, it was the cause of the fall of the heroes, the spark that turned on the tragedy. When Ares and Aphrodite were in the myths, it was as if the invisible threads of fate were intertwined, bringing not only glory or pleasure, but also suffering, betrayal and, finally, the inevitable fall. Both gods taught, through their stories, that passion could not be dominated, that, like the tide, rises and down with an uncontrollable force, dragging everything that crosses its path. Thus, passion, as represented by Ares and Aphrodite, becomes a central theme of Greek literature, a powerful and transformative force that crosses myths, tragedies, and epic, overflowing the most intense human emotions. Greek poets and philosophers understood that passion was not only a matter of love, but a primary energy that could give life, but also destroy it. And in that tension, in that clash between desire and war, between beauty and destruction, was the very essence of human experience. Greek philosophy has been, since its inception, a field of deep reflection on the most fundamental aspects of human existence, and among those aspects, love occupies an essential place. The myths of Ares and Aphrodite, although full of drama and unbridled passion, are intertwined with the most important philosophical questions about love, desire, soul and morality. Through these gods, Greek thinkers found a way to reflect on the most powerful human emotions and their consequences. In ancient Greece, love was not only a personal phenomenon, but also an issue of intellectual speculation. Ares and Aphrodite, with their tumultuous and passionate relationships, embody not only the opposites of love, but the primary forces that motivate it, the violence of war and the softness of beauty. While their myths were dyed of action and conflict, their relationship can be seen as a representation of the duality of love, that tension between what is desired and what is feared, between pleasure and pain. This vision was approached by philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, who found in the stories of these gods a metaphor of the internal struggle of the human being between the rational and the irrational. For Plato, love was more than a simple physical desire, it was a search for good and beauty. In his work The Banquet, Plato raises the idea that true love is love for the eternal and the divine, which cannot be corrupted by the ephemeral. Aphrodite's figure would fit perfectly in this concept. She not only represented physical beauty, but also love as a force that sought perfection, balance and harmony among human beings. Aphrodite, as a goddess of love, was the ideal of beauty that inspired mortals to look for something beyond the mundane, to aspire to pure love, which goes beyond physical desire. However, the love of Ares and Aphrodite also had a dark dimension. While Aphrodite was the goddess of attraction and union, Ares represented the destructive passion that, in its most intense form, can be a source of suffering. The two gods, together, embodied a deep philosophical truth: love, although deeply beautiful, can be equally dangerous. Ares, as god of war, not only represented violence, but also the irrationality of love. In myths, when Ares meets Aphrodite, his relationship is a will to how desire can snatch reason, how human passions can overflow and consume everything in its path. This relationship, although inspired by desire, was also dangerous, because love between Ares and Aphrodite not only brought beauty and connection, but also conflict, jealousy and destruction. The philosophers Stoics, which argued that true inner peace was achieved through passion's control, would find in this relationship a clear example of how excessive love can lead to loss of control. Ares and Aphrodite, being dragged by their own desires and emotions, become victims of human passion. This philosophical perspective sees the relationship of these gods not as an ideal of love, but as a warning about the dangers of giving in desire without moderation. On the other hand, Aristotle, in his Ethics to Nicomacho, argues that virtue is in balance, and love, like any other human emotion, must be moderate. While love idealized by Plato seeks to transcend the physical and the temporal, Aristotle sees love as a relationship of virtue, based on reciprocity, mutual respect and reason. In this sense, the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite can be seen as an example of what happens when love deviates from moderation and falls into the sphere of uncontrollable impulses. The passion between them has no limits, which leads to inevitable consequences: adultery, the humiliation of Hephaestus, and the public exhibition of his love in the trap woven by the jealous husband. The philosophical lesson that emerges from this myth is that love, when it is excessive or immature, can not only destroy those involved, but also those who surround them. However, the myth of Ares and Aphrodite not only raises a negative vision of love. In the same philosophical tradition, love is also understood as a means for personal growth. Although its relationship was marked by unbridled passion and complications, it was also impregnated with raw beauty that revealed the complexity of human emotions. The attraction between Ares and Aphrodite not only represented physical desire, but a deeper connection, a need to find something beyond the superficial. Through their relationship, mortals and gods could see the truth of love reflected, which is full of contradictions, which can be both beautiful and the most painful one that one experiences. In the philosophy of love, the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite can also be interpreted as a self-discovery trip. In mythology, it is often the moments of greatest chaos and conflict that allow individuals, or gods, to discover who they really are. In this sense, the myths of these two gods become a mirror of emotional struggles and internal conflicts that all human beings face. The passion of Ares and Aphrodite, with all its imperfections and defects, reflects that constant human struggle to find the balance between desire, reason, love and virtue. The relationship between Ares and Aphrodite, being a reflection of human passions, invites us to reflect on the complexities of love in everyday life. The philosophy of love, as addressed through these myths, is not only an abstract issue, but something deeply linked to our daily experience. Intense, impulsive, and sometimes destructive loves are as part of our existence as those that teach us about beauty, union, and inner peace. In the background, the myths of Ares and Aphrodite show us that love cannot be reduced to a single form, but is a spectrum of experiences, often contradictory, that define our humanity. The history of the Hephaestus trap, a story of revenge, deception, and passion, has been a source of inspiration in visual arts throughout the centuries, capturing the attention of artists from various eras. This myth, full of emotion and drama, has offered painters, sculptors, and other artists a rich palette of human emotions to explore. In particular, the scene of the capture of Ares and Aphrodite trapped in the network woven by Hephaestus has been represented in various ways, not only by its symbolic load, but also by the tension between beauty, betrayal, and humiliation it evokes. Since ancient times, Greek mythology has been a constant source of inspiration for art. In ancient Greece, the myths of the gods and their interactions formed a rich tapestry of themes for sculptures and ceramics. However, it was during the Renaissance and later in Baroque painting when the story of Hephaestus, Ares, and Aphrodite acquired a renewed prominence. Artists from these times found in the myth a space to explore internal conflicts, human passions, and moral lessons. One of the first places where we find the representation of this story is in the Greek vessels and ceramics. In these works, although the scene of the Hephaestus trap is not common, we do find representations of the gods of Olympus and scenes of love and revenge that suggest the dynamics between Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus. In the paintings of these vessels, the gods are often shown in intense attitudes, reflecting their desires and emotions. In some, Ares and Aphrodite are portrayed in their passionate relationship, while Hephaestus, such as the god of the blacksmith, is sometimes shown in separate scenes, working in his workshop. Although it is not common to find direct representations of the trap, the nuances of revenge and betrayal were already present in these first images. During the Renaissance, the Italian artists, such as Botticelli, Raphael, and Miguel Angel, were attracted to the classic myths and represented them in their frescoes, paintings, and sculptures. The Hephaestus trap, with its drama and the game of beauty and humiliation, offered a fascinating vision to explore. In the Renaissance, the concept of divine beauty, like the one that Aphrodite represented, joined with the exploration of darker issues, such as deception and revenge. However, the myth also lent himself to the expression of a certain moral vision. The trap of Hephaestus, a lesson on betrayal, divine justice, and the destiny of the gods, was presented as a reminder of the complexities of love and honor. A remarkable example is Raphael's fresco The School of Athens, which, although it does not directly represent the trap of Hephaestus, captures the spirit of Greek mythology in a vibrant scene and full of interaction between gods and philosophers. The artists of the Renaissance reinterpreted the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite, emphasizing their beauty and passion, while Hephaestus became a symbol of revenge and divine justice. The idea of this network that Hephaestus creates, as a metaphor for the inevitable consequences of deception and infidelity, translates into the work of art not only as a physical object, but as a visual idea that is represented as an inexorable force that catches the gods. Baroque painting, known for its emphasis on drama, emotion, and contrast of lights and shadows, was especially suitable for portraying this myth. Artists such as Peter Paul Rubens and Guido Reni explored classical mythology with a dynamic style that put the emotional tension of myths in the foreground. In works such as A Venus and Mars, by Rubens, you can see a vibrant representation of the goddess Aphrodite and the god Ares, wrapped in a scene of desire and beauty, while the shadow of Hephaestus stalks as a reminder of the betrayal that is coming. Aphrodite's sensuality and Ares's virility stand out on the canvas, but the presence of Hephaestus, although not directly visible, feels like an imminent shadow that could crumble this idyllic world at any time. Rubens' work, although he does not specifically represent the Hephaestus trap, suggests the emotions and consequences of infidelity. The sensuality of the bare bodies, the warm colors and the curved shapes, capture the intensity of the relationship of Ares and Aphrodite, while the dark background and the subtle signals of jealousy and revenge presage the inevitable destiny of lovers. The use of color and light in these works accentuates the tension between the idealized beauty of the gods and the shadow of the humiliation that is yet to come. The 19th century also saw a rebirth of interest in Greek myths, with romantic artists such as Eugene Delacroix, who painted mythology scenes with an emotionally loaded approach. In his work Venus and Mars, Delacroix captures not only the beauty of the gods, but the complexity of their feelings. The influence of the Hephaestus trap in these works is felt in the latent tension between desire and the inevitable rupture. Delacroix's work, with his dramatic and emotional style, interprets passion as an internal conflict that triggers the fall of the characters, a lot as myth does it by exposing infidelity. In the modern era, artists continue to interpret the myth of Hephaestus through a contemporary lens, often highlighting the contrast between external beauty and internal suffering. Modern art interprets the trap of Hephaestus as an allegory of human vulnerability to complex emotions, love, anger, betrayal, and revenge. In contemporary painting and sculpture, artists often use the image of the network, the physical and emotional restriction of trapped lovers, as a metaphor of the social and psychological forces that catch individuals. The history of Hephaestus' trap remains a powerful inspiration for visual artists who continue to explore the universal themes of love, betrayal, revenge, and beauty. From ancient ceramics to contemporary painting, the myth continues to offer a space for reflection on deeper human emotions. Hephaestus, Ares, and Aphrodite are still symbols of the complexity of human nature, and in each work of art, its history reinvents itself, adapting to the concerns, values, and visions of the world of each era. The Hephaestus trap is not only a story of trapped gods, but an eternal representation of the internal struggle between love and suffering, between beauty and humiliation. Ares and Aphrodite, over the centuries, have been central figures in Greek mythology, but their influence has not disappeared in modern culture. In fact, their presence has resurfaced in literature, cinema, and other media, adapting to times and reflecting the evolution of social values, but keeping intact the passions that define them: love, desire, war, and revenge. The history of these two gods remains a mirror that reflects the complexities of human emotions, and their image has been reconfigured to fit into modern scenarios, where human passions continue to be a source of inspiration. In contemporary literature, Greek myths remain a rich land for writers. Ares and Aphrodite, with their prohibited and tragic love story, have been reinterpreted in numerous contexts, from novels to poems, and from plays to fantasy series. The figure of Ares, the god of war, has been a powerful metaphor for violence and confrontation in modern times. Often, writers present it as a complex character, sometimes monstrous, sometimes misunderstood, but always full of internal conflicts. His relationship with Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and love, is often portrayed as a contrast between the violence of war and the softness of seduction, a clash of irreconcilable forces that generates tension and drama. Aphrodite, meanwhile, has been represented in many different ways in modern literature. In the current context, his figure has been associated not only with romantic love, but also with the struggle for autonomy and female empowerment. The goddess of love is often a woman who embodies independence, beauty, and desire, but also the complexity of human relations. Aphrodite is more than a passive beauty figure. In many contemporary representations, she is a woman who takes control of her destiny, challenging social norms and expectations. This new interpretation of Aphrodite makes it a more empowered figure, a goddess whose strength lies in its ability to influence love and war equally, and not in its physical beauty alone. The cinema, on the other hand, has embraced these two gods with fervor, bringing them to the big screen with interpretations that cover from the epic to the modern. Adventure and fantasy films, such as those based on the stories of the Greek gods, have represented Ares as a violent and vindictive warrior, while Aphrodite, mostly, is portrayed as the figure that inspires love and beauty in the middle of conflicts. In the Percy Jackson saga, for example, the Greek gods are presented modernly, but with the essence of their original characteristics. Ares is a character full of anger and internal conflicts, while Aphrodite represents idealized love, although with touches of irony and complexity. In contemporary cinema, the representation of these gods has evolved to adapt to the issues of popular culture. Ares, the god of war, appears in several action films such as the antagonist that symbolizes destruction and chaos. In superhero films, where the struggle between good and evil is the nucleus of the plot, Ares often personifies uncontrollable violence and the brutality of war. On the other hand, Aphrodite, in the current cinematographic context, has been adapted as a figure that, despite its superficial beauty, is able to move the world through its influence on human relationships. The films not only present it as a goddess of love in a romantic sense, but as a power that is capable of changing the course of events through the manipulation of human desires and emotions. In addition, the influence of Ares and Aphrodite can be seen in popular television series such as Wonder Woman, where Ares becomes one of the most notorious villains, representing everything negative of war and violence, while Aphrodite, although it is not a main character, plays an important role in the creation of Diana, the heroine of history. Ares, in these representations, becomes the perfect antagonist, a god whose only mission seems to be to sow chaos, while Aphrodite, through his teachings and his influence, acts as a protective figure that symbolizes beauty and love as constructive forces instead of destructive. In comics, Ares and Aphrodite also occupy an important place. Ares is presented as the god of war in many high superhero stories, a powerful figure that not only seeks physical destruction, but also tries to manipulate humans for their own benefit. The relationship with Aphrodite, however, remains a mixture of attraction and conflict. Aphrodite, in comic stories, is not always presented as a passive figure. On the contrary, its power over love and beauty becomes a tool that can change the destiny of the characters. In some stories, Aphrodite is a figure that defies the traditional expectations of women as a passive muse, showing that love can be as destructive as war is. In the field of music and fashion, Ares and Aphrodite figures have also been integrated, influencing cultural and stylistic trends. Love songs, for example, often evoke the themes associated with Aphrodite: desire, beauty, attraction. On the other hand, the concept of war and conflict, represented by Ares, remains a powerful metaphor for the problems and challenges we face in modern life. The relationship between Ares and Aphrodite has therefore been a constant symbol in the popular culture of how love and war are not separate forces, but intertwined, as a reflection of contradictions within the human soul. In addition, the impact of Ares and Aphrodite extends to fashion and design, where their images have been used to symbolize the internal struggle between beauty and conflict. The fashion catwalks, for example, often play with the duality of these two deities, creating collections that balance the soft with the strong, the delicate with the aggressive. In fashion literature, Aphrodite's influence is manifested in the idea of unattainable beauty, while Ares symbolizes internal force, power over adversity. In summary, Ares and Aphrodite are still living and vibrant figures in modern culture. Its relationship, marked by attraction and conflict, love and war, continues to be a faithful reflection of the tensions inherent in the human being. In literature, cinema, comics and other media, its history adapts and reinvents itself to resonate with today's audiences, showing that, although forms change, fundamental human emotions remain the same. The myths of Ares and Aphrodite, through the centuries, have transcended their origins as simple stories of gods and heroes to become powerful psychological archetypes that shape the understanding of the human psyche. These two gods not only represent specific aspects of Greek mythology, but also embody universal forces present in all human beings. In this sense, the history of Ares and Aphrodite has served as a mirror to understand the internal struggles, desires, and conflicts that we all face, either in the personal, emotional, or social sphere. Ares, the god of war, represents the archetype of the warrior and the fighter. It is the incarnation of action, competition, and confrontation. His presence in Greek myth symbolizes aggression, anger, but also courage and honor on the battlefield. This archetype is not limited to the physical scope of the struggle, but also reflects the internal conflicts that we all face when we are forced to make difficult decisions, fight for what we believe, or face the consequences of our own overflowing emotions. Ares is not only a war, but also a symbol of the most intense aspects of the human psyche, the part of us who faces challenges, who feels driven to fight for what he wants and fights against injustices. In many ways, Ares is the figure that reminds us of the struggle for survival, the need to conquer obstacles, and the constant internal war that we all experience between reason and emotion. This archetype of Ares is deeply linked to male energy, not only in terms of the physical, but also as a metaphor for determination and action in everyday life. In modern culture, this image of Ares remains relevant, especially in contexts where the will to face adversities is put into play, either personal or professional. In contemporary man, this archetype can be manifested as a need to affirm one's identity, take control, or resist in situations that require resistance. However, the danger of this archetype is that, like Ares, it can lead us to arrogance, brutality, and lack of empathy. The warrior who does not know when to stop, the fighter who is consumed by violence, is a shadow of the archetype of Ares that can be destructive if these energies are not properly balanced. Aphrodite, on the other hand, is the goddess of love and beauty, an archetype that represents desire, attraction, seduction, and emotional connection. It is female energy par excellence, but also the force that moves relationships, creativity, and the ability to link with others. In the modern world, the archetype of Aphrodite manifests itself in many ways, in romantic love, in family relationships, in the deep connection with the beauty of the world, and in the human need to be loved. Aphrodite not only represents love in its traditional sense, but also harmony, grace, and the ability to create connections that transcend the physical. This archetype, like Ares, is full of complexity. On the one hand, Aphrodite's energy can inspire deep and transformative relationships, but it can also lead us to the dependence, obsession, and sacrifice of the self in the name of love. The archetype of Aphrodite is related to the ability to attract, both physical and emotional. In its most positive form, it connects us with our creativity and with our ability to give and receive love. This archetype reminds us that love is not only an emotional experience, but also a powerful force that molds our relationships and our decisions. However, Aphrodite's dark side can manifest itself as a superficial attraction or as the search for external validation through beauty or desire. The myth of the prohibited relationship with Ares, in particular, highlights Aphrodite's vulnerability. Although he is able to generate an almost divine beauty, he is also trapped by his own passion, his desire to be loved, and his fight against norms and expectations social. This dynamic in which love can be both a blessing and a curse is a deep characteristic of Aphrodite's archetype. The contrast between Ares and Aphrodite as psychological archetypes also reflects the duality that exists in all people. At the bottom of our psyche, we all carry within an internal war between impulsive action and seductive softness, between the desire to conquer and the desire to connect. The relationship between Ares and Aphrodite represents this struggle between action and passivity, between aggression and attraction, and between war and love. Both archetypes exist in all of us, and, although we can identify more with one than with another at certain times of our life, we are all able to manifest both aspects in different circumstances. The myths of Ares and Aphrodite not only illustrate the archetypes of struggle and love, but also teach us about the inherent tension between these forces. Love and war are two apparently opposite forces, but they are often intertwined. The myth of Ares and Aphrodite, with its history of prohibited passion and the revenge of Hephaestus, reflects how love can trigger conflicts, how war can be driven by desire, and how relationships, even the most powerful, can lead us to situations painful and unexpected. The history of these Greek gods thus becomes a map that guides us through the psychological archetypes that we all carry inside. Like Ares, each of us can find moments in which we feel driven to act furiously, to fight for something we feel worthwhile, whether personal or professional. And, like Aphrodite, we all seek love, beauty, and emotional connection, but we can also fall into the trap of idealizing love or looking for it in ways that are not always healthy. Both archetypes, that of Ares and Aphrodite, invite us to reflect on how we handle these forces in our daily lives, how we balance desire with reason, action with emotion. The influence of these archetypes is not only limited to ancient myths, but remains powerful in the way we understand and address our own lives. Both Ares and Aphrodite tell us about the tensions that exist between our passions and our decisions, between what we want and what we need, between what we love and what we fear. By understanding these archetypes and their manifestations in our own lives, we can begin to recognize the forces that move us and learn to navigate the complex emotional landscapes that we all inhabit. The prohibited love story between Ares and Aphrodite is one of the most loaded with passion and consequences within Greek mythology, and its repercussions not only resonate myths, but also in the depths of human psychology. This relationship, born of an irrepressible desire and a love that defies divine norms, offers a fascinating perspective on the darkest aspects of human nature, reflecting how love and passion can be powerful forces that transcend logic, but that inevitably lead us to internal and external conflicts. In a sense ecological, this story symbolizes repressed impulses, dissatisfied desires, and constant pulls and loosen between duty and desire. The concept of forbidden love is one of the deepest sources of suffering, but also of desire and fascination. Ares and Aphrodite, being two figures of mythology loaded with energy and contradictions, perfectly represent the human impulses that cannot be ignored. The love between them is an act of transgression, an impulse that defies not only the social and divine rules, but also the internal structures of each of them. At the psychological level, this reflects how individuals can experience an internal struggle between what they want and what society, morals, or their own values allow them to desire. In the case of Ares, the god of war, his passion for Aphrodite is an escape to his violent and often lonely nature. Ares, despite his status as god of conflict and battle, is deeply marked by his inability to emotionally connect in a healthy way. In the myth, his attraction for Aphrodite is not only an act of physical desire, but also an emotional need. Ares seeks in Aphrodite something that cannot be found on the battlefield: softness, beauty, deep emotional connection. But this love is, of course, dangerous and unsustainable, because Aphrodite is married to Hephaestus, and her desire, although legitimate, looks like a violation of the rules of the divine order. From a psychological perspective, the forbidden love of Ares and Aphrodite can be understood as a manifestation of repressed desires and internal conflicts. Ares represents the constant struggle between the desire for love and compulsion for violent action, while Aphrodite represents love as a force that, despite its beauty, is not exempt from consequences. On many occasions, human beings feel trapped between what they really want and what society or its own morality dictates as acceptable. The history of Ares and Aphrodite reflects this tension, where love becomes an engine that drives the person to challenge the norms, and at the same time, the transgression of these norms becomes the root of anguish. On the other hand, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, represents the archetype of woman who is not only desire, but also a woman who manipulates the desire to obtain power and control. Despite being the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite does not escape the emotional complexities that love entails. She, like Ares, experiences the vulnerability that is born from forbidden love. Love for Ares challenges the expectations that her husband, Hephaestus, has about her, and at the same time challenges the divine expectations about fidelity. In this sense, Aphrodite represents the desire for connection and the search for a true love, but also symbolizes the pain that can come from that same search when the line of what is allowed is crossed. The psychological impact of this forbidden relationship is not only a reflection of the internal conflicts of individuals, but also of the broader social dynamics. In the context of the Greek gods, the adultery of Aphrodite with Ares is more than a simple betrayal of her husband. It is a subversion of the divine principles and the destabilization of the cosmic order. This type of transgression highlights the power of human desire against the norms that, supposedly, limit it. The desire, both in Ares and Aphrodite, is a primitive force that cannot be controlled, and in this sense, its history reflects the struggle between individuality and the expectations imposed from abroad. In addition, the myth of Ares and Aphrodite is particularly interesting because it addresses the question of guilt and punishment. The act of transgressing the forbidden brings consequences, and this becomes a crucial psychological lesson. Guilt and remorse are often the shadows that accompany the overflowing passion. Although Ares and Aphrodite are gods and, therefore, they are not subject to the same moral rules as mortals, the psychological impact of their forbidden love remains clear. Both face rejection, Clark, and revenge as a result of their transgression. The story of his love reflects how desire can lead to self-destruction, how passion can corrupt what initially seemed to be a pure connection, and how the guilt for disobeying the rules can become an unbearable weight. From a psychological perspective, this type of love is related to the notion of temptation and the danger of desire. In everyday life, we all experience desires that may seem unattainable or impossible, either because of social restrictions, personal values, or circumstances. The history of Ares and Aphrodite shows us how these wishes can consume us, how love and desire, they can cloud our ability to judge, and how transgressions, even when they seem to be a source of happiness or momentary liberation, usually bring a heavy emotional load. This load can manifest as guilt, repentance, or a feeling of having betrayed something bigger than oneself. In many cases, people who experience prohibited love or a relationship that defies social norms often face feelings of confusion and internal conflict. The desire to be with the beloved person conflicts with the expectations of others and, sometimes, with the person's own morality. This can cause a feeling of disorientation, anxiety, and stress, since the individual is caught between two worlds, one in which love and desire are oppressed and another in which passion is carried away regardless of the consequences. The history of Ares and Aphrodite illustrates this conflict, showing how human emotions, when they are not controlled or understood, can overflow and lead to situations of suffering. Ultimately, the forbidden love of Ares and Aphrodite also highlights the dilemma of personal identity to external expectations. The love between these two gods, as the forbidden love that we can all experience at some point in our lives, raises the question, how much are we willing to sacrifice for love? Are we willing to face the consequences of our deepest desires, even when those wishes challenge everything we have learned about what is correct and acceptable? Through the passion of Ares and Aphrodite, we see that love is not simply a gift, but a dangerous, transformative, and sometimes destructive force. Love and war, two apparently opposite forces, converge in a surprising way in the myth of Ares and Aphrodite. In Greek mythology, these two gods represent completely different spheres of influence. Ares, the god of war, embodies violence, conflict and conquest. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, symbolizes harmony, attraction and desire. However, despite their antagonistic nature, both myths intertwine, revealing that love and war, far from being opposite, are forces that often coexist, feed and transform each other. In this sense, the history of Ares and Aphrodite offers a deep vision of how these apparently incompatible forces can be complementary, and how, in many cases, which seems like a clash between opposite passions is actually a complex and intertwined dance of human emotions. Fundamental. Love and war, in its purest manifestation, are intense impulses that have the power to transform both individuals and societies. Ares, as god of war, is not only represented as the symbol of physical violence and external conflict, but also as the god who drives human beings to fight for what they want, to challenge adversities and to face their deepest fears. For its part, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, stands as the force that moves people to connect, to join and find beauty and meaning in their relationships. But even the purest love is not free of struggle. The desire, as force that moves humans to connect, is always surrounded by conflict, challenges, obstacles, whether internal or external. In this sense, love is not just a quiet feeling, but it can be as passionate and turbulent as the war itself. The relationship between Ares and Aphrodite is, in many ways, a reflection of the intersection between these two aspects of the human being. Although there are two deeply different gods, their mutual attraction demonstrates that war and love are, in some way, connected through the passion they both arouse. War, with their ability to drag people into extreme situations, can arouse intense feelings of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. In fact, in many cultures, war has been seen as a way to prove love and devotion, not only towards loved ones, but also towards causes, nations, or ideas. Love, on the other hand, can be an internal war, a struggle to achieve the attention, affection, and acceptance of the other. The desire to be loved can be as strong as the impulse to conquer an unknown territory, and in fact, sometimes, human emotions that arise from love can trigger violent conflicts, either in the form of jealousy, rivalries, or overflowing passions. In the myth of Ares and Aphrodite, war is not only a physical battlefield, but also a space of emotional and psychological conquest. Love between Ares and Aphrodite is an act of rebellion, transgression, a challenge to the divine and social norms that regulate the behavior of the goddess. This act of disobedience, this impulse to fight for what is desired, is the emotional war that both gods fight within themselves and against the structures established by Olympus. The fact that his love is forbidden only intensifies the passion with which they live it, transforming what could be a simple romance into a struggle full of tensions, internal and external conflicts, and painful consequences. But the connection between love and war is not limited only to the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite. In many other myths and stories, the war arises from unrequited love, from dissatisfied desire, or from the rivalry between beings fighting for the affection of an idealized figure. The war, in this sense, becomes the emotional battlefield in which human beings try to forge connections, establish relationships, or prove their worth. The myths of heroes and gods in Greek mythology are plagued by love stories that cause epic struggles: Helena and Paris, Achilles and sponsorship, Perseus and Andromeda. Each of these stories shows how love can be a force that not only inspires, but also destroys, leading the characters to fight battles, both physical and emotional, to achieve what they want. War and love are also deeply connected through the figure of sacrifice. In both cases, love and war require sacrifices. The warriors fight for their ideals, for their loves, and in the process, they must put their own life and well-being into play. Love, meanwhile, also entails sacrifices, either in the form of personal resignations, total delivery to another person, or confrontation with their own insecurities. Ares and Aphrodite, being gods that represent these opposite poles, show how sacrifice is a constant in both areas. In their relationship, both must face the consequences of their actions, whether the wrath of Hephaestus or the mocking laugh of the other gods. This emotional sacrifice, which is inherent both love and war, reflects a universal truth: Both forces have the power to overflow and take us to extreme situations, but they can also lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our emotions. In war, as in love, there is also the possibility of reconciliation and transformation. Although Ares and Aphrodite face humiliation and punishment for their forbidden love, their destinations are not sealed in the tragedy. History shows that, despite the brutality of war and the intensity of love, both are an essential part of human experience. Love can be a force that inspires people to face their deepest fears, while war, in its most symbolic form, can lead to liberation, overcome the limits themselves, and the creation of something new. Throughout history, war and love have intertwined in a complex way, creating a cycle of destruction and creation that never stops. In Greek mythology, this duality is clearly reflected in the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite. What begins as a risky and prohibited passion becomes a lesson on tensions between the most fundamental human impulses, the need to love and the need to fight. Through this connection, we understand that love is not exempt from conflicts and challenges, and that war, far from simply a field of destruction, can also be proof of what we are able to sacrifice for what we love. The history of Ares and Aphrodite, like many other legends, teaches us that these two forces are not separated, but are two sides of the same currency, two forces that, when balanced, can generate a life full of passion, fight, and meaning. Revenge is one of the most powerful and destructive forces in Greek mythology, and the story of Hephaestus, Ares, and Aphrodite is no exception. Hephaestus, the hero god, symbolizes justice that seeks to balance pain with compensation, but his revenge is not an answer that restores order, but one that has all involved in a cycle of suffering and irrevocable consequences. When Hephaestus discovers the infidelity of his wife Aphrodite with Ares, not only an act of revenge is triggered, but also the beginning of a tragedy that will affect all the gods of Olympus. Hephaestus' pain is not limited to a simple betrayal, his suffering is double. First, because his wife, whom he had created with so much love and dedication, has betrayed him with another god, and second, because that betrayal is carried out with the god of war, a being so fierce and distant, which makes him the pain of humiliation is even more bitter. Hephaestus' revenge is not driven only by the desire to punish lovers, but also for a deep need to restore their own dignity and affirm their lugar in Olympus. This is the revenge of a man who has been stripped of his honor and who, at the same time, feels that he has been belittled by his own body, by his deformity, for his inability to meet the divine expectations of beauty. When taking revenge, Hephaestus not only punishes those guilty of betrayal, but also seeks personal justice that validates him, that makes him feel that he has control over his destiny. The act of revenge of Hephaestus, although it would seem like a fair reaction in any human context, fails to restore balance, but deepens wounds and tensions. When building the magical network and catching Ares and Aphrodite in it, Hephaestus exposes not only infidelity, but also the very fragility of divine emotions. In his eagerness to humiliate lovers, Hephaestus not only punishes those who betrayed him, but also exposes the vulnerability and humanity of the gods themselves, making them something closer and, therefore, more vulnerable to the passions and desires of the mortals. The gods, in their apparent perfection and power, are not exempt from the same weaknesses that affect human beings. The revenge of Hephaestus reveals that divine power, although absolute in many ways, is not exempt from the same emotional sufferings and dilemmas that mortals face. The consequences of Hephaestus' revenge, however, are not limited only to the public humiliation of Ares and Aphrodite. Although they make fun of them, even the most powerful gods of Olympus, the tragedy lies in what happens next. Hephaestus, by inflicting his punishment, not only hurts Ares and Aphrodite, but also affects the stability of Olympus himself. The public exposition of human weakness, shame, and imperfection between the gods leads to a series of changes in the perception that other gods have of themselves and their place in the world. This act of revenge does not bring a resolution, but rather a spiral fall in which the deepest human emotions, such as anger, pain, and humiliation, infect everyone present. The tragedy intensifies when one realizes that revenge, instead of providing satisfaction, leaves a Hephaestus marked by an emotional vacuum that he can never fill out. His suffering becomes a chain of remuneration, an endless spiral that moves him away from any possibility of finding peace. Ares and Aphrodite, trapped in the magical network, suffer public humiliation and mockery, but their pain is not as devastating as Hephaestus'. They continue with their relationship, facing criticism and consequences, but without falling completely into the abyss of despair that consumes Hephaestus. Revenge, ultimately, does not destroy them as individual beings, but leaves a permanent scar in their relationship and in their image as gods. Hephaestus' suffering is even more tragic because he finds no comfort in revenge. Although he manages to humiliate the culprits, his soul remains restless, plunged into the pain of a justice that does not satisfy his deep emotional emptiness. Revenge does not bring healing, but deepens the abyss between what one wants and what it really needs. Hephaestus, unable to restore what has been broken, ends up trapped in its own network of anger and desolation. The tragedy of your revenge is the reminder that the desire for punishment and compensation can rarely heal deep emotional wounds. The justice that seeks, far from releasing his heart, makes him a prisoner of his own grudges. In a broader plane, Hephaestus' revenge reflects the uselessness of punishments when they are based solely on the desire to inflict pain. The myth reveals that revenge, instead of being a solution, is only an extension of suffering. In the end, Hephaestus faces the bitter truth that no matter how ingenious his trap is, the punishment will not bring the peace that longs for. In this sense, revenge is a vicious circle that consumes all involved, and instead of providing justice, it becomes a source of greater suffering for those who seek it. Through the tragedy of Hephaestus' revenge, myth invites us to reflect on the emotional consequences of anger, pain, and revenge. Sometimes, the greatest damage is not caused by the punishment to those who have hurt us, but the damage we do to ourselves by clinging to those destructive feelings. Hephaestus, in the end, has not only avenged his honor, but has also lost the ability to find a form of redemption or comfort. The history of his revenge becomes a heartbreaking reminder that the desire for compensation can lead us to places of loneliness and despair, where true damage is not caused by the action of others, but the lack of internal release that prevents us from healing. Forgiveness in the divine world, especially in Olympus, it is not a simple concept or a common practice. The Greek gods, unlike mortals, are not beings who easily grant forgiveness, nor do they usually regret their actions. Greek mythology, with all its complexity and drama, reflects a world of emotions and intense desires, where justice and revenge prevail many times above reconciliation. However, behind the intricate relationships between the gods, between anger and suffering, a lesson of forgiveness arises that, although rare, has the power to transform destinations and restore balance in Olympus. In the history of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus, betrayal and revenge seem to be the engines that move the actions of the gods. Ares and Aphrodite, in their forbidden love, commit a fault towards Hephaestus, an act that places them in the center of an emotional storm. Hephaestus, devastated by betrayal, faces a crucial decision: maintaining the grudge or seeking a way of forgiving lovers who have stained their honor. Revenge, at first, seems the only way to heal their wounds, but, deep down, Hephaestus knows that he will not find peace or satisfaction through the suffering of others. Although their magical network brings them public humiliation, your heart is still injured and your soul is still empty. It is in this pain where the lesson of forgiveness begins to take shape. Throughout mythology, forgiveness is not easily given, and those who seek redemption find an immediate solution. The gods, often more focused on maintaining their power and status, are not known for forgiving generously. However, there are times when forgiveness becomes inevitable, especially when deeper human emotions, such as love and guilt, come into play. When Ares and Aphrodite are trapped in the network of Hephaestus, shame and public suffering are not enough to heal the wound of Hephaestus. As much as he wants to punish and humiliate the culprits, something within him, perhaps unrequited love or understanding the inevitability of human nature, leads him to reconsider the weight of his revenge. At this point, forgiveness becomes an option not only for the culprits, but for Hephaestus himself, who must face the bitter truth that his anger will not release him. Reconciliation in the divine world is also an act of recognition of the imperfection of the gods. Despite their power and beauty, the Greek gods are subject to passions and desires that make them vulnerable. Ares, the god of war, is dragged by his desire to Aphrodite, without thinking about the consequences. Aphrodite, goddess of love, is equally human in her desire for passion and beauty, and her attraction towards us arises from a need that goes beyond reason. Hephaestus, on the other hand, is aware of his limitation, his body, and his position within the Olympus. Unlike his classmates, he is caught in human emotions of betrayal, pain, and anger. When reconciliation becomes necessary, the gods must accept that, like mortals, they are condemned to experience the same feelings of vulnerability and error. Forgiveness, then, in the world of the gods, is not so much a matter of benevolence or magnanimity, but a need to restore balance. Peace in Olympus cannot be achieved through the destruction of the other or through eternal punishment. Forgiveness, although often painful, is the only way to harmony. In the case of Hephaestus, reconciliation with Ares and Aphrodite would not only restore the balance between the gods, but would also be an act of personal healing for him, a way of freeing himself from the weight of anger and the resentment he has led during both time. Forgiveness, in the end, offers Hephaestus the possibility of healing his own emotional wounds, of freeing himself from the need for revenge that his prisoner soul has maintained. In Greek mythology, although we rarely see a perfect reconciliation, there are times when the gods are finally found in common terrain, beyond their conflicts and selfishness. In many stories, reconciliation is not given by the magnanimity of one or the plea of the other, but as a result of the inevitability of destiny. The gods, like humans, must face the consequences of their actions, and forgiveness becomes a necessary step towards restoration of order. The history of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus is a clear example of how, even among the gods, pain and humiliation can give way to understanding and the need to leave the old grudges behind. Reconciliation is not only an external process, but also internal. In the divine world, the gods should not only forgive each other, but they must also forgive themselves. In the history of Hephaestus, for example, the real resolution does not reach until he is able to recognize his own suffering and accept the imperfect nature of his emotions. By releasing Ares and Aphrodite from his magical network, Hephaestus takes a step towards personal healing. In this sense, forgiveness becomes an act of internal liberation, a process that not only benefits others, but also provides peace and comfort to the one who grants forgiveness. On a deeper plane, the concept of forgiveness in the divine world also reflects the impermanence of human emotions. Rancor and pain can be overwhelming, but in Olympus, as in the life of mortals, nothing is eternal. Emotions, although intense, eventually give way to understanding and growth. Thus, forgiveness becomes a tool for change, not only for the gods, but for all human beings who, like them, must learn to release what hurts them to advance. Ultimately, forgiveness in the divine world is a reflection on the fragility of human and divine relationships, about the inevitability of the emotions that unite us, and about the importance of reconciliation, not only to restore external order, but also to heal the internal soul. The history of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus is a reminder that, in a world marked by intense passions, peace can only be achieved when we are able to free ourselves from the weight of the past and embrace the possibility of a new harmony. In the ancient world, Greek myths were not mere stories that were told around fire or banquets, they were deeply moralizing lessons that served as guides for human behavior, reflecting the virtues and defects of the gods in the context of human relations. The history of Ares and Aphrodite, marked by passion, betrayal, and revenge, offers a rich reflection on the moral dilemmas that the Greeks faced. This story not only speaks of the gods, but also of the darkest aspects of human nature, touching issues of loyalty, justice, love, and the price of decisions. First, the relationship between Ares and Aphrodite confronts us with the question of faithfulness. The adultery of Aphrodite, married to Hephaestus, is one of the most betrayal acts in Greek mythology, because not only violates the sacred link of marriage, but also challenges the established divine order. Ares, the god of war, presents himself as the passionate, impulsive, and fierce lover, without concern for the consequences of his actions. Aphrodite, on the other hand, is the goddess of love and beauty, and although her desire towards us is natural from her perspective, it also represents a form of dangerous and unbridled love, which lacks limits. Myths teach that love without restrictions, without obligation, and without responsibility, can lead to chaos. The history of Ares and Aphrodite, then, highlights the dangers of giving in impulses without considering the damage that can be caused to others. On the other hand, Hephaestus, upon learning of his wife's infidelity, acts from pain and resentment, triggering a series of tragic consequences. His decision to take revenge on lovers in a magical network reflects the internal struggle that everyone faces when they feel betrayed, the impulse to punish, to make the other suffer the same as oneself. However, what history shows forcefully is that revenge rarely offers expected satisfaction. Although Hephaestus has the right to feel injured, his act of punishment does not heal his soul or restores his honor. Instead of recovering his dignity, he is caught in a cycle of resentment and humiliation. This part of the story underlines a key lesson: revenge can be tempting, but it is not the answer to overcome pain or find inner peace. The moral that can be extracted from this episode is that the damage caused by betrayal and injustice should not be answered with more damage, but with wisdom and understanding. Greek mythology, with its pantheon complex of gods, invites us to reflect on how our own emotions and desires can overflow and lead us to make decisions that not only affect others, but also destroy us. Instead of focusing on remuneration, the gods teach us that the path to peace goes through forgiveness and acceptance of human imperfection. Of course, history also offers lessons about the nature of love. Ares and Aphrodite, in their relationship, represent love in its most overwhelmed and passionate form, but also in its most destructive form. Passion without reflection, without awareness of others, can destroy not only personal relationships, but also the balance of the forces that guide the cosmos. The myth reminds us that love should not be a force that gets out of control, but that must be in balance with morality and ethics. The relationship of Ares and Aphrodite is, in many ways, a reminder that love must be responsible, respectful and, above all, aware of its own limits. Another aspect that is addressed in history is the power of public image and humiliation. Hephaestus, when catching lovers on the network, not only seeks revenge, but also exposes their pain to other gods, making it public and humiliating. The moral lesson here is that the exposure of the suffering of others can give a false sense of justice. The public punishment rarely relieves the interior pain of those who inflict it, much less the one who receives it. The true power of healing a wound is not in the public humiliation of the other, but in the ability to find a space for empathy and understanding, even in times of greatest anger and pain. The Greek gods, with all their passions and defects, are a mirror of human nature. Each of them reflects aspects of our own existence: uncontrollable desires, the suffering caused by betrayal, revenge that consumes us, and the difficulty of forgiving. The myth of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus highlights that morality is not found in a simple dichotomy of good and bad, but in the management of the most complex aspects of our psychology and our emotions. It teaches us that love, loyalty, revenge, and forgiveness are forces that must be careful, because the decisions we make from them can change our lives and those of others in irreversible ways. History also illustrates how passions can cloud the judgment and how morality is not always clear in moments of emotional conflict. Sometimes, the actions of the gods seem justified from their perspective, but as history develops, we realize that repercussions are deeper and more devastating than initially thought. This aspect of history is particularly relevant in a contemporary context, where human emotions remain as intense and complex as in Greek mythology. In the end, the history of Ares and Aphrodite offers a reflection on the costs of unbridled desire and the importance of considering the consequences of our actions. The myth shows that morality is not only a matter of rigid rules, but of how we handle our emotions and how our decisions impact others. The lesson is clear: passion and love must be guided by ethics, understanding, and the ability to forgive. Only then, both the gods and mortals can find a form of harmony. In Olympus, where the gods reign with absolute power, justice does not always present itself as a clear and defined idea. Like mortals, the gods are trapped in a complex network of emotions, desires, and decisions that often collide with each other. However, in this chaotic universe, divine love and justice, although apparently opposite, are deeply intertwined. The stories of the Greek gods show us that justice is not always measured by righteousness or equity, but by the way in which human passions and feelings, including love and desire, influence divine decisions. Love, in its purest form, is an uncontrollable and sometimes destructive force. The Greek gods, such as Ares and Aphrodite, represent this type of love that overflows, which does not understand limits or consequences. The desire between Ares and Aphrodite, although beautiful in its intensity, not only defies the rules of Olympus, but also endangers the divine order. In the history of betrayal, when Aphrodite falls in love with Ares and betrays her Hephaestus husband, love becomes an act of rebellion against justice established in marriage. The heart of Aphrodite and Ares beats strongly, driven by a passion that cannot be contained, but the chaos that generates is equally unstoppable. This is where divine justice is intertwined with love, not in the way in which the gods punish the guilty, but in how the very nature of their relationships affects the cosmic order. Hephaestus, the betrayed husband, could have been limited to physical punishment or an act of revenge, but in his despair and pain, creates a magical network that catches lovers. It is a punishment, but it is also an expression of its own suffering and a lesson about the power of love to disrupt the balance of things. In this act of revenge, justice is not just about punishing, but about restoring an emotional balance that reflects the reality of pain and abandonment that Hephaestus feels. The revenge of Hephaestus, in the end, is not only an act of justice, but also a reflection of his own inability to understand the love that unites Ares and Aphrodite. The gods not only do they judge the actions of others, but their own feelings distort their perception of what is fair and what is not. Hephaestus, seeking divine justice, is caught by his own pain, and his response to love becomes a kind of personal justice, an emotional justice that, although effective in his revenge, does not solve the deep wounds he carries. But, ultimately, divine love and justice cannot be separated. The gods, despite their defects and passions, are subject to the same cosmic forces that govern the universe. In their search for justice, the gods must face the reality of their own humanity, an aspect that reflects the lessons about love and justice that mortals must also learn. The history of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus shows that love, although powerful, is not invulnerable to the consequences of human actions. On the other hand, justice, although severe, must also consider the feelings and emotions that define the beings that apply it. When Hephaestus exposes Ares and Aphrodite trapped in the network, the humiliation he inflicts is a form of justice, but it is also a lesson about the pain that revenge can cause. In his attempt to do justice, Hephaestus not only punishes lovers, but also drags the gods of Olympus in an atmosphere of mockery and sadness. The gods, observing the scene, not only laugh at the suffering of Ares and Aphrodite, but are also forced to reflect on the price of unbridled passion and the need to understand the emotional complexities of justice. It is here, in the heart of the tragedy, where divine love and justice are intertwined more deeply. Hephaestus's justice is not perfect, in fact, it is marked by the pain and anger you feel. But it is that same anger that leads him to understand that true justice cannot be achieved only through revenge, but through the understanding of human passions. The love that Ares and Aphrodite share, although painful for Hephaestus, is also a reminder that love is not always fair, but it can be the force that drives the gods and mortals to recognize the need for redemption. Divine justice is not just about giving punishments, but about understanding that all actions, even the most painful, have consequences. Love and justice, as divine forces, are destined to balance each other, through reflection and reconciliation. The history of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus reveals that, although the gods often act according to their own desires and passions, they must also face the consequences of those desires. The gods are not oblivious to human nature, in fact, their stories reflect the struggles, triumphs, and falls of mortals themselves. In the end, love and justice in Greek mythology teach us that both forces are fundamental for the understanding of the cosmic order. Love, in its purest form, is not limited to possession or desire, but is marked by the need for mutual balance and respect. Justice, on the other hand, is not only a matter of punishment, but to understand the motivations and emotions that guide actions. In the divine world, as in human, love and justice are complex forces that must be handled with wisdom, because only when they balance, true harmony is reached. In the modern world, where Greek mythology remains one of the richest sources of cultural inspiration, the figures of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus maintain a relevance that goes beyond the ancient stories. These gods not only belong to the past, but continue to influence our understanding of the deepest aspects of human nature, from war and love to revenge, creativity and betrayal. In an era marked by globalization, technological advances, and social transformations, Greek myths remain a powerful tool to explore emotions and conflicts that are still present in our daily lives. Ares, the god of war, resonates in a world where armed conflicts continue to be a sad reality. While modern wars are no longer freed with swords and spears, but with advanced technology and complex tactics, Ares' symbolism remains pertinent. His image is not only associated with struggle and violence, but also with the aggressiveness inherent in human conflicts. In a contemporary context, Ares can be seen as a representation of the internal war that many people experience, that constant struggle that some feel within themselves between anger, the desire for power, and the desire for peace. In current societies, where the issues of power and control continue to be hot issues in politics and relations internationals, Ars is a reminder of how human passions can unleash destructive forces, which are often difficult to control. On the other hand, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, remains an essential figure when it comes to understanding the complexity of human desire. In an era where social networks, advertising, and cultural trends massively influence. However, its influence also highlights the unrealistic difficulties and expectations that may arise around love and beauty. Today, with the overabundance of idealized images and stereotypes about what is attractive or loving, Aphrodite remains a mirror of what can be a passionate but also destructive love, a love that can be unattainable or superficial, or even possessive and selfish. Aphrodite also reflects the dynamics of love in the modern context, where desire and infidelity continue to be very relevant issues. In a society where relationships are increasingly influenced by the speed of digital communication and the ease of connecting with others, the history of their betrayal with Ars offers a deep reflection on the complexities of love and loyalty. The figure of Aphrodite, like love in itself, is ambiguous and multifaceted, trapped between the search for emotional connection and the need for personal autonomy. His influence on the modern world invites us to question the limits of passion, the importance of loyalty, and the need for sincerity in relationships. Finally, Hephaestus, the forgedor god, offers us a reflection on creativity, creation, and revenge, but also about self-acceptance and personal value. At present, Hephaestus resonates especially in the fields of technology, engineering, and arts, where creativity becomes an act of construction and destruction at the same time. Like Hephaestus, many people in the modern world are constantly forging new ideas and projects, but also face the frustration of being misunderstood or undervalued. Its unrequited love story and their revenge are a reflection of how, often, feelings of rejection or insecurity can promote people to create something spectacular, but also to make impulsive decisions that do not always result in what they expect. Hephaestus is also a symbol of those who, despite adversities, manage to find their own path, adapt and prosper in the world, even when they are not the most recognized or admired. The figure of Hephaestus also offers a lesson about the importance of resilience in the modern world. Despite the humiliation that suffers, its ability to move forward and continue creating is a reminder that true strength is not always shown in appearance or physical power, but in the ability to overcome emotional challenges and move on. In times of crisis, in which many people feel overwhelmed by external pressures, the history of Hephaestus shows that pain and frustration can become the spark that ignites creativity and innovation. The relevance of these deities today extends beyond the limits of mythology. Ars, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus are not only symbols of antiquity, they are reflexes of the human condition. In modern society, where emotional tensions, love dilemmas, internal conflicts, and power struggles continue to affect our lives, these mythological figures remain useful to understand the forces that move us. The passions that the Greek gods embody are not only present in the stories of the ancients, but also in each of us, in our relationships, our decisions, and our internal struggles. Today, Ars remains a representation of conflict and human aggressiveness, a reminder that violence and hatred not only occur in battlefields, but also in people's hearts. Aphrodite remains an image of what we want and what it drives us to connect with others, but also reminds us of the dangers of a love that can be uncontrollable and destructive. Hephaestus, meanwhile, remains a symbol of those who feel rejected or misunderstood, but who find a way to redeem their pain through creation and personal overcoming. In a constant change, the myths of the Greek gods remain relevant because they address the universal themes of human nature. Through the stories of Ars, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus, we can see our own internal struggles, our overflowing passions, our betrayals, and our attempts for redemption. In their complexity, these myths continue to offer valuable lessons on how to face extreme emotions, how to deal with the consequences of our decisions, and how to find the balance between justice, love, and revenge. The history of Ars, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus is, in many ways, an eternal dance between love, betrayal, and revenge, a cycle that, although it is repeated over the centuries, never loses its power to move. The Greek gods, although immortal, do not escape the emotions and passions that mark the course of their lives, and it is precisely that latent humanity that makes their stories remain so shocking for future generations. The trap woven by Hephaestus, in his attempt to take revenge on the betrayal of his wife, is only one of the many stories that teach us about the complexities of desire, suffering, and forgiveness. But it is also a lesson about the eternal struggle for power, beauty, and justice, universal issues that are still in force today. The love between Ares and Aphrodite, although arising from passion and transgression, has not been destroyed by public humiliation. Despite the trap that Hephaestus tended, the exposition of their relationship with the other gods, Ares and Aphrodite remain powerful symbols of the irresistible attraction that often challenges the morality and established norms. Their love is marked by complicity, desire, and contradiction, something that makes them human despite their divine nature. Despite conflicts, betrayals, and consequences of their actions, they remain a force that cannot be contained or erased from history. And it is in that contradiction, in the fragility of their feelings and in the perpetuity of his passion, where lies the eternity of his history. For his part, Hephaestus, the foregone god, although injured by betrayal, has not been defeated. His pain led him to creation, to revenge, but also to introspection. In his own suffering and in his response to the betrayal of Aphrodite, Hephaestus shows us that redemption can arise from the darkest places. Like their ability to forge, its ability to adapt and evolve in pain reminds us that, deep down, scars are also part of what defines us. In the case of Hephaestus, that ability to transform suffering into art, into a sublime creation, makes it a symbol of resilience and the constant search for meaning in the midst of chaos. In the end, Hephaestus' trap was not only a revenge, but a means to deal with pain, and its history teaches us that even deeper humiliation can be part of a healing process. And although the situation ended with the mockery of the gods and the shame of the trapped lovers, the lessons that emerge from history remain intact. Revenge did not destroy the love of Ares and Aphrodite, nor annul the art of Hephaestus, rather, he pushed them towards a deeper reflection on their own being, their destiny, and the interaction between the most complex human emotions. The immortality of these stories is not found alone in their characters, but in the universal emotions that represent passion, desire, betrayal, suffering, revenge, and forgiveness. These emotions are not only confined to ancient stories, but are still in force today, where people continue to face the same internal and external struggles. The gods of Olympus, with their stories of love and war, are not oblivious to the passions that define human existence. And it is precisely why, over the centuries, myths have remained as a mirror of our own nature, reflecting the ups and downs of life with clarity that remains deeply relevant. The fate of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus is not just that of three deities trapped in a network of love, revenge, and humiliation. His history has transcended time, reminding us that human errors and passions are what makes us feel alive. In each of us, there is a part of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus, the struggle for power and love, the desire to be loved and accepted, the search for revenge for the betrayal suffered, and the capacity for creation and transformation in the face of pain. Thus, the myth of Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus not only remains alive in the ancient stories told in the temples or in the artistic representations that adorn the museums. It is at the bottom of each love that begins with an uncontrollable spark, in each heart broken by betrayal and in each action driven by the desire for revenge. These myths do not belong to the past, they live with us, as a part of our own humanity, and they are the lessons that the ancient stories offer us, those that continue to mold our understanding of love, power, and justice in the modern. For all these reasons, the history of the Hephaestus trap, the forbidden love between Ares and Aphrodite, and the consequences of their actions not only lasts in the world of the gods, but has transcended until it becomes a reflection of our own experiences. Every time we face a betrayal, a challenging love, or an internal struggle, the echo of this ancient history resonates, reminding us that human passions not only define the gods, but also define us.